My health was not the best, and I often had incredible bowel pains and seemed to go up and down in my moods, especially when I was feeling low blood sugar. We learned quickly that when we left the house, if I hadn't eaten, I was cranky. My husband took me to the library after shortly meeting him and said, "You have got to learn about your colon." Hello, and welcome back to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and today I'll be attempting to summarize the semi-coherent book Feel the Fire by Melanie Gibb, who was Lori Vallow Daybell's best friend for a time. I'm recording this on December 8th, and I'm still reeling from the news that the judge in Lori's case has ruled that she is both mentally competent and will be allowed to represent herself, which, I don't know, my heart goes out to the Woodcocks and Crescia and Adam Cox and Colby and everyone who's going to have to deal with her machinations in court, including Melanie Gibb, whom I'm sure will receive a special amount of vitriol. I understand that Lori has a legal right to do this, but that doesn't change the fact that her victims are going to be further traumatized. Before we get started, I want to say something about this channel and my approach to the cases I cover. I discussed some of this in a blog post I wrote about Sarah Boone's sentencing, but I think it's worth talking about here. I'm not interested in blanket condemnations of the people I discuss. A lot of the true crime channels are focused on emphasizing how terrible criminals are, on justifying and amplifying outrage, and that's fine. I'm not criticizing those channels or saying they should do anything differently. I watch those channels, I like those channels, and I think that diving into that sort of pain can often help us process it. But that's not my interest. And let's face it, YouTube is too much work to make videos about things that don't interest me. What I find interesting is the complexity of people who commit crimes or who are crime adjacent, like Melanie Gibb. I want to understand the paradoxes. How can we have parts of us that are shining examples of the human spirit and other parts that are destructive and cruel and selfish? And how can those exist side by side in the same physical body? I want to see the complete person, contradictions and all. That's what I try to do on this channel. And while I acknowledge people's failures and crimes, I'm not really here to inventory their sins. So if you clicked on this video to listen to me talk about how Melanie Gibb is pure evil and deserves the same punishment as Chad because she's just as bad, you're probably going to be disappointed. You're definitely going to be disappointed, because I don't think Melanie Gibb is evil. I've watched every interview I could find, I've listened to all of her testimony, and I've read her book 3 times, and I don't see any evidence that she's evil. If what you were hoping to hear is that she's a terrible, useless person who has no business being on the face of the earth, you might want to look for a different video. But if you genuinely want to understand who she is as a person and how her willful blindness led her to wander into a cult like a disoriented toddler, stick around. And if you're wondering who Melanie Gibb even is and why I'm talking about her, then this section of the video is for you. Not a great deal is known about Melanie Gibb, but we do know that she and Chad Daybell met at a talk he gave in the summer of 2017. Melanie was introduced to Lori Vallow by Jason Mao a few months later. In fact, Melanie is the one who introduced Chad and Lori. She and Lori were best friends and saw each other every day for months. After Alex, no one was closer to Chad and Lori. By Melanie's own account, she knew that Lori and Alex killed Lori's 4th husband, Charles Vallow, or, as Melanie described it to Sherry Dottle, Lori and Alex set Charles up to be killed in self-defense. I'm pretty sure that's not how self-defense works. Melanie has never been charged with a crime in connection to Chad and Lori's crimes, and as far as we know, she wasn't offered immunity when she testified. A lot of people have questioned why she hasn't been charged. I've gone through as many videos of her as I can find, and I think the reason is that she wasn't directly involved in any of the deaths or in their planning. A lot of people don't believe that, but I actually do. Melanie isn't a great liar, so it's pretty easy to tell when she's fibbing, and we'll get into what I think she lied about later. That said, I believe she had a clear moral responsibility to go to the police after Charles died and say, Lori and Alex and Chad planned this. I believe she could have prevented 3 deaths if she had. She has no excuse for not alerting authorities when she heard that Tylee had been declared a zombie. By then, she knew what happened to zombies. I'm not sure what her legal responsibilities were, and I think that if authorities could have charged her, they probably would have. That said, I know a lot of people are deeply angry at Melanie, and I think that's justified. I'm going to try to approach her book with compassion and give her a measure of grace, because my interest is always in seeing the complexity of people. But don't let that mislead you into thinking I don't feel she's ethically responsible, even if she isn't legally responsible. My understanding of why this book exists is that Melanie wanted to be the next Julie Rowe. She saw Chad and Julie and Jason Mao speaking at these Mormon doomsday prepper conventions, and she wanted that life for herself. She wanted to be seen as a wise spiritual leader. And Chad told her, all you need to do is write a book, and then you can talk about your book at the conventions and sell copies. So Melanie wrote a book called Feel the Fire, and she self-published it in September of 2019, 8 days after Tylee Ryan lost her life. Everything I say on this channel is opinion, and it's speculative opinion at that. I'm reminding you of this not because I'm worried Melanie will sue me, but because this book is so poorly written that it's incredibly hard to draw conclusions based on the text. To really figure out what she's saying here, you'd need a psychologist, an English professor, an LDS theologian, and a private investigator, and I'm none of those things. These are my best guesses and nothing more. And just a quick thank you to everyone for your patience and well wishes since I've been sick. Unfortunately, I have a lousy immune system, and with my asthma, I'm especially prone to respiratory infections. It's unlikely this will be the last time I'm sick this winter, but knowing that the delay wasn't going to cost me a bundle of subscribers made it easier to rest, so thank you. Alright, let's dig into this thing. Fun note here. Remember how all of Chad's books fell apart when you tried to read them? Like the bindings all crumbled and the pages fell out? Well, Melanie's book is tight as a drum, and I don't know who printed this, but the cover is so thick and stiff that it actually cuts into my hand a little. It's uncomfortable to hold. There are technically 3 forewords to this book. The first is by Vallow Daybell, and I think this is the only thing she's written that I've ever come across. It's a shockingly coherent, brief, altogether appropriate plug for her friend, which surprised me, for obvious reasons. Because this is the only document that Lori has written that I've gotten a hold of, I'm going to read the entire thing. This book, Feel the Fire, will inspire you and help you recognize and break the dark chains in your life. The author, Melanie Gibb, shares many eternal truths and truths about her own life that will help you feel the fire that only having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ can bring. Melanie is a fun-loving wife, mother, and friend who puts it all out there in this book to help people find a higher and more meaningful relationship with the Savior. I definitely felt the spiritual fire reading this book, and thank Melanie for all of her efforts in helping everyone get to that next level in their eternal progression. Don't miss out on this opportunity to feel the fire that will change your life. Lori Vallow. I honestly don't know what to say about this other than, yeah, that sounds like something a normal person would write in the foreword to a friend's book. One thing that stands out to me, and this might be a cultural thing within the LDS community, is how often Lori and Melanie describe each other and other women as fun-loving. It isn't a term I hear applied to women in their 40s very often. Also, when did they ever do anything fun? There's nothing wrong with going to the temple and studying scriptures and talking about deeply personal spiritual experiences, but fun isn't the right word to describe them. I mean, what do we know that they did together? They cast out demons. They went to firesides and prepper cons. Maybe the prepper cons were fun, being outside, building forts, learning to fish. But mostly it sounds like listening to long, strange lectures by people as engaging as Chad Daybell and as disorganized as Julie Rowe. I just think fun is a peculiar adjective to use in this context. The second foreword was written by Jason Mao. And yes, I have Jason Mao's books. I will definitely get around to doing at least one video on his young adult fiction someday, and after listening to his podcast episodes with Lori and Melanie, I think I might read his nonfiction book too. This foreword actually sounds like it was written by someone who has a basic understanding of marketing. Unfortunately, it suffers from what seems to be a pervasive problem in Mao's writing. He overwrites. Here's an example. Writing this personal journey toward the light makes Melanie a pathfinder for all of those lost in the wilderness of this mortal existence. Melanie cut a swath through the malaise of our own personal ignorances, and with her example marked the trail that points the way to the true meaning of redemption. It's just a bit much, you know? And then he plugs his Warrior Ethos platform. He and Melanie were co-hosts of the Time to Warrior Up podcast, on which Chad was a guest. The third foreword is by none other than Chad Daybell. Spring Creek Books was up and running at this point, and I'm curious why Chad didn't publish this book, given that he's the one who told Melanie to write it. Chad's foreword is hilarious, because it's mostly about him. I had just finished writing my Times of Turmoil series, and I felt a strong impression to speak in Arizona about my novels. I had been to Phoenix only once before, nearly 15 years earlier, and I didn't have a clue of how to arrange a speaking event there. Then a voice told me, "Contact Melanie Gibb." He manages to insert himself in nearly every sentence. Not to mention that he wrote 4 times more than Lori or Jason Mao, and I'm not convinced he actually read the book. Thus end the forewords. Chapter 1, Feel the Fire. My name is Melanie Gibb, and I was raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. I have 1 sister and 2 younger brothers. My parents are both converts to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the religion in which I was raised. I had the privilege of serving a mission for our church in Sacramento, California, from 1992 to 1993. I met my husband in Salt Lake City, and we have 4 boys. We have raised our children in Arizona for most of their life. I grew up in a pretty dysfunctional home and didn't learn a lot about life skills, but got a great education about Babylon through endless hours watching TV. Unfortunately, my resume is not filled with degrees. Instead, it is filled with lessons from the hard knocks of life. Despite Chad's assurance that the book is full of personal stories, Melanie almost never tells you anything of substance about herself. This is one of the few times in the book when she's going to give you straight facts about her life. Also, she's got a bee in her bonnet about television. This is the first of several times she's going to mention it. When I turned 38, I had a mighty change of heart caused by a major personal crisis. Both of these experiences has caused such an incredible change in my life that I have been changed forever. She feels that this change of heart is significant enough that it deserves to be capitalized. But she doesn't actually want to tell us what happened. We never learn what this personal crisis was, although I figure it would have happened in approximately 2009, give or take a couple of years. In one of her police interviews, she alludes to the fact that it involved her first husband. Oh, and Melanie loves exclamation points. I don't think I've ever read a book with this many exclamation points. If she really wants to emphasize something, she'll put 2 or 3 at the end of a sentence. Something I think can be very telling is how people describe themselves. I speak in a very real manner when I have a chance to speak. I speak openly about my life, my struggles, and how God has helped me find solutions to my problems. I do this because most people struggle, and they often think that it takes a perfect life, perfect upbringing, or a good deal of education in order to succeed. But I am here to prove otherwise. I have often given classes in my home and have spoken at conferences and began podcasting with Time to Warrior Up as of recently. Yes, I have been born of God, as the scriptures would say. I have been born again. I feel his fire. To that, I can testify that he can change you, because he has changed me. Little grammatical aside, Melanie frequently uses a hyphen in place of an M dash or an N dash. The formatting of this book is atrocious. No one proofread this. I've corrected it in the on-screen excerpts because it's very confusing as written. Anyway, Melanie's statement that she speaks in a very real manner about her life and struggles is absurd. She's constantly making oblique references to this change of heart she had. She sometimes drops details but doesn't give enough foundation to make sense of them. It's pretty infuriating, and it's an early indicator that she cannot or will not accurately describe herself. As I was combing through her interviews, I found some other statements she's made about how she sees herself. She describes herself as a very open person and kind of a chill person. It's hard for me to believe she sees herself as a very open person, given how reluctant she is to talk about her actual experiences, but I think she believes it. I think kind of a chill person is how she explains that she rarely, if ever, seems to engage with her emotions. That's part of why so many people hate her. She has never expressed real regret or sorrow over any of the deaths in this case. She's never appeared sad. And when she does express emotion, it's often inappropriate. I'm thinking of how judgmentally she spoke about Tylee to the police and to Sherry Dottle, and even on the stand. When called out on it, she insisted, "I'm always kind." I'm also thinking about her outrageous statements to Nate Eaton about how much she loves Chad and what a great guy he is. The only time I've seen her tear up is when she was talking about how sad it is that Chad and Lori can't be together now. Here's some other statements she's made. "I'm not a person who dislikes people or hates people. That's not my personality. I always have hope for everybody. That's not my personality, to gossip." While Melanie is far from being the narcissist Chad is, it's obvious that she cares a lot about how people see her. She wants to be seen as a wise, spiritual person who doesn't judge or gossip. Writing this book was part of her attempt to appear so. And I'll tell you, I believe her desire for spiritual growth is sincere. I think it's sincere to the point of desperation. I don't know what happened in her youth to make her feel like her spiritual life is more important than anything, but it must have been something both profound and enduring. I want to share an experience that happened a few years ago. I was standing in a camping store and I saw a man trying on hats. We started chatting and he told me he was from out of town. After talking a bit, he informed me he didn't believe in God. I told him, "Yes, you do." And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Yes, you do." And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Yes, you do." He then said, "How do you know?" I said, as I took my hand and put it over my heart, "Because I feel him right here." He finally admitted he did and said, "God wouldn't love me because I have done so many bad things." I proceeded to tell him there wasn't anything he could do that God would stop loving him. I looked him deep in the eyes and said, boldly, "You know how much I love you. Is it possible that I could love you more than God does?" And I said, "No, it isn't possible." As we departed, I told him it was a pleasure meeting him, and he then said, "I love you." I replied, "I love you too." I'm very curious about how the conversation shifted from hats to God. I feel conflicted about this story because, on the one hand, I've had some rather amazing spiritual experiences of my own with people I've just met. It is possible. And maybe this really happened, and if it did, I hope it was exactly what this man needed. But let's look at it without the spirit-tinted glasses for a second. Exactly what did Melanie think gave her the right to tell this man what he believed? And not just tell him, she berates him into admitting he believes in God. I'm not sure if he really does, or if he just wanted this strange woman to stop yelling at him in a camping store. And I'm not really sure what she thought she was accomplishing. I don't want to mock Melanie for this, because, as she pointed out, she hasn't had the benefit of a long education. But I can't really talk about this book without addressing the fact that it's barely coherent at all. In this excerpt, she begins mid-story. "So I prayed with all the energy of my heart." When? Why? The "so" at the beginning suggests the continuation of a narrative, but there's no narrative leading up to this story. So I prayed with all the energy of my heart. What do you think happened? Yes, I was given trials that were too difficult for me to love on my own. I would need a savior to help me with this one. As I prayed more, it seemed it became harder. This is the first I've heard of loving trials. It's not an idea I'm familiar with, but it sounds very in keeping with Christianity. But the next paragraph comes out of nowhere. I eventually started taking classes to learn how to control my kids. I know you are laughing right now. After taking that same 6-week course over and over for 1.5 years, I finally realized it was me that needed to learn how to control me. Revelation. Wait, what's happening with her kids? There's no setup for this story. It was a class where she could learn to control her kids, which implies her kids were out of control, but we don't hear anything about that. A fairly serious writing mistake, obviously. But this story just raises so many other questions. If she actually took a 6-week course for 1.5 years, that means she went through it 13 times. This story reminds me of, this description, this whatever it is, reminds me of an experience I had. I do a little quilting, and I took a bunch of classes from this amazing quilter and teacher who does Baltimore quilts, which involve itty-bitty pieces of fabric appliqued onto a background. One day she told us that the maximum number of times she would remove a piece and restitch it in order to get it perfect was 13. And I just sat there and waited for the punchline, but no one laughed. And then she said, "You each need to decide what your number is." And I thought to myself, my number is 3, and that includes the first attempt. If I can't get it after the 3rd try, I'm not going to get it. And I'm okay with that. I don't want to live in the prison of perfection. How many times was Melanie Gibb willing to take this class? At what point do you say, this isn't working? Have you ever heard that expression? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. And the kicker is, it apparently took 18 months of watching these techniques fail with her kids before she thought, maybe I'm contributing to the problems here. I don't know why she didn't think to ask herself that sooner. I mean, how many other people did she cycle through blaming before she was willing to consider herself? 18 months is a long time to spend blaming other people. I'm getting a reluctance to take accountability here, and that's going to be a major theme. I learned how to handle confrontation without getting angry, and found some things that would help me come up with some good old-fashioned consequences. I started feeling hopeful. I stopped losing my temper so much. I started really changing as a person. She mentions anger and temper here. I'm not sure what to make of this comment about learning to think up consequences, which seems like the kind of thing you could easily Google. The fact that she had to learn how to think of them suggests she wasn't enforcing consequences for her children previously. Apparently because she couldn't think of any. I learned how to control me, master my own emotions. It was liberating. I felt free. Free to make my own choices not based upon my children's reactions to life. I finally felt in charge of me. The comment about making choices not based on her children's reactions to life make me think, as before, that she was having a hard time enforcing consequences. I'm always wary when I hear the words master and emotions together. When people talk about mastering their emotions, what they usually mean is suppressing them or ignoring them. At least that's been my experience. Often people think that expressing an emotion is allowing it to be out of control in some way. Maybe that isn't what Melanie meant here, but her writing is so removed from actual experiences that I have no way of knowing. So here's what I'm taking from this page, which I've read about 6 times now. I want to reiterate that this is all my speculation. It sounds like Melanie had issues parenting her kids, at least part of which stemmed from backing down when her kids would get upset over punishments. And she signed up for parenting classes, repeating the same 6 weeks of lessons for a year and a half, before realizing that maybe the issue wasn't that she simply lacked parenting skill, it was that she personally had emotional or psychological issues, quite possibly involving losing her temper. She might have been blowing up at her kids and declaring wildly harsh punishments and then having to walk them back later. She might have been telling her kids they were due for a certain punishment, and then the kids cried and she caved. I'm imagining something in that vein. She goes on. How beautiful it was for me, because I had spent so many years trying to find out how to do it the way Father in Heaven wanted me to do it. I prayed, I cried, I pled, and finally the day came when I was in a place in my heart to hear it. Here we're getting one of the cornerstones of Melanie's belief system. She feels that God wants us to live in a particular way, and if we figure out what that way is, our lives will be peaceful and easy. Then she reaches the second cornerstone. Why is it so hard to give up our will? We have desires and needs, and somehow we think someone else can fill those desires and needs. Let's analyze that philosophy for a moment. If you give me all my needs, then I will finally be happy. We want someone to make us happy, this perfect man or woman. But happiness is something that comes from the soul, not outside. Again, this feels avoidant to me. She's saying that the way to be happy is to not have desires or needs because we can't rely on anyone to fulfill them. And there's an extent to which she's right. The rudiments of happiness have to come from within us. But it's really hard for happiness to do so if we don't have the things we need, like shelter and a peaceful place to live and a partner who doesn't scream at us. This book never sticks with one topic for very long, and there's no organization of the chapters. So if it seems like I'm jumping randomly from one topic to another, it's because I am. Here, Melanie decides to talk about babies for a minute. When I look at a little baby, I truly am amazed how much love and light flow from their little faces when they look at you. We all love for babies to smile at us. Think about it. They really have nothing to be happy about. They can't do anything for themselves other than poo and wee and drink. Here. Thanks for the rundown on infants, Mel. On the next page, we hear a little bit about her marriage. After marrying my husband from South Africa, I began to see how completely different we were. I didn't know how much I really didn't know. My life was getting ready to discover just how little I was prepared for marriage, life skills, and motherhood. It became quite evident to my husband that I didn't really know how to cook after cooking my first breakfast for him the first morning of our marriage. After months of feeling pretty low about my ability to cook, he kindly invited me to open cookbooks and try to experiment and create some new skills in the kitchen. I was intimidated and overwhelmed at the thought of trying new things, and cried often, not having any confidence in myself. I'm not holding out on you. We're never given any other information about her husband, like where they met or his name, although I found it online. It's Brendan. To the best of my knowledge, this is the same husband she divorced after meeting Lori. According to the Maricopa County Clerk's website, her husband filed for divorce in 2019, which is interesting because Melanie claimed in one of her police interviews that she's the one who initiated the divorce. Hilarious aside, according to the county clerk's website, Melanie and her husband both had to take a parenting class when they got divorced. I guess the first 13 times she took it didn't count. At the time, they had 3 sons who were still minors. Melanie comes off as naive here, but also incompetent, and even worse, just generally incapable. Not only can she not cook, she's too intimidated by the thought of trying to learn a new skill to even try. This lack of self-confidence must be really pervasive. She continues talking about her husband. He was quite alarmed about my lack of knowledge when we discussed history, geography, and several subjects about our educational upbringings. He went to a private school in South Africa and got the best of the best teachers money could buy. I went to the local public schools in North Carolina, in which the educational system was pretty bad. My teachers were inept at teaching history, while my husband was writing 2-hour exams on the rise and fall of Germany. I had no clue how clueless I really was. I think that's probably still true. I'm curious how these two ended up together. He's well-educated and worldly, and she's poorly educated and so unsure of herself that she's scared to learn things. There isn't enough here for me to characterize their relationship, but I wonder if there was an unequal power dynamic between them. If Brendan is who I think he is, he's a chiropractor, but he became a chiropractor after being a lawyer, and that feels like it would fit the dynamic here. Being well-educated and successful in multiple fields would certainly give him an intellectual advantage over Melanie. The impression is only strengthened by the next section Melanie writes about her health. My health was not the best, and I often had incredible bowel pains and seemed to go up and down in my moods, especially when I was feeling low blood sugar. We learned quickly that when we left the house, if I hadn't eaten, I was cranky. My husband took me to the library after shortly meeting him and said, "You have got to learn about your colon." To be honest, I didn't even really know what that meant. We checked out 4 to 5 books about health. I really had a desire to learn about my body, but I was intimidated. Again, intimidated. The idea of this man taking her to the library and telling her, "You have got to learn about your colon," it just sounds so condescending. Like, who talks to their partner like that? Maybe a chiropractor, but it's not a good idea. Melanie ended up having to cut white sugar out of her diet. It really helped me take control of my life, for I was greatly addicted to sugar. But what I ultimately came to realize many years later, that we must learn to master all of our cravings and carnal desires. God wanted something more for me. He wanted me to know I could do anything I put my mind to if I understood the bigger picture. He wanted me to feel in control of myself, which gives you the power to know you can overcome everything that is needful in becoming godlike. I didn't realize sugar was a carnal desire. Mormons use that word slightly differently from the rest of the general population. It just means physical here. But I read this because it's again referencing this theme of self-control. She wants to be in control of her thoughts and her actions and her feelings. We hear some more about Melanie's struggles with parenting, which again paint her as almost impossibly naive. I thought having kids would be pretty easy. It seemed easy to my dad, who pretty much let us do what we wanted. I was greatly mistaken. I was now getting ready to embark on a journey that has changed my life drastically. My first child was a perfect little baby whom I felt love beyond love at the first sound of his cry as he entered the world. Never did I imagine I could feel so much love for someone I just met. It was amazing. The fact that her father let his kids do whatever they wanted reinforces my belief that Melanie had a hard time learning to set boundaries for her kids. That's a hard thing to do if it wasn't modeled for you. Her eldest son was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD, which is a challenging combination for any parent, I think, but probably even harder on someone with no self-confidence. I truly thought it was something I did or didn't do to create this challenge in him. I made it all about me. I wanted him to change. I didn't like his behavior. He was so aggressive to other children and got in trouble almost every day at school. I was so angry all the time and had no skills or ideas about how to teach him, train him, and help him. I was a victim of my circumstances. I used to say, "He will never change. There is nothing I can do about it." I felt stuck. It's interesting that Melanie simultaneously has no self-confidence and assumes everyone else is the problem. She says she was angry all the time because her child was aggressive at school, but I wonder if she's doing that thing Chad likes to do where he reverses cause and effect. Was she angry because her son was aggressive? Or was her son aggressive because his mother was always angry and that's what she was modeling for him? I don't know. Melanie's feelings got pretty intense, though. At one point, I was ready to quit being his mom. I told my husband I was done. He asked, "What is wrong with you?" I screamed, "This is too hard! I can't do it!" I hated my life. I felt stretched beyond my capacity as a mother and a person. My husband encouraged me to make a list of all the things that were troubling me. At the time, I didn't appreciate that advice. But I decided after he left I would make a list. I came to realize quickly after evaluating myself that my parenting skills were the problem. There's something here that I almost missed, and I don't know whether it's nothing or something. She says that she decided to make the list after her husband left. Left what? The room? The house? Was he trying to leave the relationship? People say crazy things that they don't mean when they're angry, and he might have known that. Maybe he left for a few hours to give Melanie space to calm down. But maybe he heard her say that she didn't want to be their child's mother anymore and decided he didn't want his child around her. This was the point at which Melanie began the endless rounds of parenting classes. I went to many parenting classes for more than a year and was determined I was going to get him to change and obey me. What I really learned is that I needed to learn to control me first. I had no control over my temper, my attitude, my anger, etc. I wanted him to change. I wanted him to be the way I wanted him to be. This was too hard, and I was overcome with despair. The issue of control seems to be pervasive among the members of Chad's cult. Chad himself is incredibly controlling. It sounds like Melanie desperately wanted to control her son, but eventually learned that she couldn't have that and had to accept that she could only control herself. After many years of praying about parenting skills, I finally received some revelation on the matter. I had the most incredibly challenging morning with one of my children, and I lost it. God then told her she could do what she wanted with her son, but there were going to be consequences. She says that she felt parented by God, but it was a loving type of parenting because he gave her a choice, so she felt respected. She said that this had an impact on the way she interacted with her son. But if you think she's going to offer him a choice, think again. After my son came home from school, I parented in a way that changed our hearts forever. I told him he was not allowed to play with his toys for a week, and he needed to spend the afternoon in his room. Well, I expected the worst, and the worst happened. I gently held him so he could not move. I looked him in the eyes and told him I would not let go until he was nice. He cried, yelled for several minutes. I looked back down into his eyes again and said, "I've got all day. Just let me know when you are ready, 'cause it's all up to you. You have the power to make that choice. I will wait until you are ready. Just let me know." I made sure I was quiet, respectful to his choices during that screaming session. I did not speak except for those few words. I held my peace with love during the whole process. He finally surrendered and said, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I love you." I held him in my arms with so much love that he quickly got onto the couch and said something so amazing to me that I will never forget. "Mom, you don't have to lock the door. I will stay in my room, and I don't even deserve my toys." He understood. He got it. My heart rejoiced. I praised God and prayed in my heart with gratitude for showing me how to love my child through discipline. Life-changing. To this day, we are the best of friends. I just love that kid. The number of red flags in this passage is truly terrifying. The fact that her child says, "You don't have to lock me in my room, I'll stay there," that's not okay. That's not parenting. That's avoiding parenting. She doesn't tell us exactly what happened between her and her son, but the line, "I expected the worse and the worse happened," is ominous. There's a lie of omission here, and it points at something pretty sinister. Something happened between the time she told her son he wasn't allowed to play with a single toy for a week and the time she gently held him while he screamed and cried. And she doesn't want to tell us what it was. This holding him and refusing to let him go is something called holding therapy. It's a controversial practice that no major autism organization endorses, partly because it's led to the deaths of children. In a blog post on the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry's website, Dr. Kim J. Masters wrote, "Those opposed to holding cite the post-traumatic stress disorder literature about potential trauma from holding, which can result from being controlled, overpowered, and helpless in the hands of an adult captor masquerading as a therapeutic parent. They would see holding as an example of authoritarian and coercive parenting, i.e., you will do it my way now or stay in my lap until you submit. Repetitive experiences with this procedure might then lead to its internalization as a traumatic experience with PTSD sequela. Furthermore, since authoritarian parenting is seen as the seedbed for promoting conduct problems in children, and authoritarian styles as the basis for troubles in professional child staff, holding is seen as sending the wrong disciplining and parenting message." Translation: this will make your kids' behavior worse and quite possibly give them PTSD. Does it surprise me that Melanie Gibb would buy into something as detrimental as therapeutic holding? No. As we're going to see in the next excerpt, Mel has no ability or desire to evaluate sources of information. In fact, you could argue that's how she wound up following Chad and Lori. But it does surprise me that she would claim that God taught her how to parent by giving her a choice, so she turned around and did the exact opposite to her kid. He understood. He got it. My heart rejoiced. I praised God. She's celebrating breaking her son's spirit. She held him down until he gave up. And she doesn't say how long she had to hold him before this miraculous transformation, but proponents of therapeutic holding often advocate holding children down for hours at a time. Dateline covered a so-called success story in which a child was routinely held anywhere from 12 to 6 hours. That is not parenting. I am very close to someone with autism, and the thought of someone holding him down like this when he was a kid makes me physically ill. I am hoping that Melanie's son is okay. She follows up this horrifying story with a Wayne Dyer quote comparing children to oranges that need to be squeezed, and I almost quit the book at this point. Melanie says this quote is what taught her that she needed to fix herself, but I don't know how she got there from this, and she's been saying that for pages now, always followed up by an example of how she continued to blame her son. Parenting by the Book by John Rosemond and Dare to Discipline by Dobson are the best parenting books I've ever read. They were based on Judeo-Christian values. They are not your new parenting ideas that are filled with philosophy, but are good old-fashioned parenting ways from Grandma and Grandpa's time, filled with wisdom from the scriptures. John Rosemond is a newspaper columnist who believes in punishing children instead of praising them. James Dobson is a minister and psychologist who founded the right-wing hate tank Focus on the Family and advocates putting your infant on a blanket and hitting them every time they try to crawl off. I can't say anything more about him without wanting to swan dive into a wood chipper, but I will link a very good video from Fundie Fridays before. The good Reverend Jen can tell you more than you ever wanted to know about James Dobson. Although Melanie doesn't say that these two books on how to emotionally cripple your children were required reading for the parenting classes she took, that's the implication from the way they're dropped into the text. Melanie says that after reading these amazing books on how to ensure that your children grow up and never want to speak to you again, she asked the facilitator of the parenting class to do a marriage counseling session with Melanie and her husband. And instead, the facilitator told her to read a book called Leadership and Self-Deception. I had never heard of this book, but I looked it up. An Amazon review from Dr. Richard Nongard reads, "This book was just awful. And this review is based on my opinion. based on my experience as a licensed mental health professional and corporate trainer. I suspect it is popular not because it causes the reader to change, but because every narcissistic manager feels everyone else needs to change and buys them a copy. The story is bizarre. The main character, Bud, is as self-deceptive as the employees he thinks he is helping. The fictional dialogue is condescending, and if you held these fictional meetings with real employees, you would have the making of a workplace nightmare. It's a fictionalized business self-help story. The authorship is credited to the Arbinger Institute, which is a Mormon business consulting firm. Here's another review. Unabashed cash grab. Unbelievably simplistic and full of logical, moral smoke and mirrors. Modern corporate snake oil. A full third of the book is spent selling you on how great this book is. I don't know how anybody with an ounce of emotional intelligence could walk away from this feeling enlightened. I bet you bought this book because your company asked you to. One person found this helpful. It was me. I found this review helpful. I also found helpful the numerous reviews that warned not to buy a paper copy of the book because the most recent printing run was missing the first 34 pages. I guess they used the same printer Chad did. What does it mean that Melanie Gibb liked these books? Well, as far as the so-called parenting books go, I think it means that she found authors who would justify her determination to control her autistic child at all costs. If you find being a parent frustrating, and a book comes along that tells you you're not only justified in physically dominating your child until they submit, but you're doing them a disservice if you don't treat them that way, you're going to like that book. You're going to use it to justify your behavior. As for leadership and self-deception, Melanie explains, sort of. Upon reading the book about my self-deception, I decided my husband needed a lot of changing. What? Did you not read the title? As I read more and more, I finally came to the correct conclusion that it was me that needed to change. Self-deception is a tricky thing. Most of us feel justified for a variety of reasons why we are right and why others are wrong. This is the most deceiving part about it. It is hidden ever so tightly in a pattern of lies and betrayal. Again, a reluctance to hold herself accountable. Ironically, I think that reading a book on self-deception and concluding that your husband is the problem is likely a form of self-deception. As for the rest of the excerpt, I've gone over it with a fine-tooth comb and I can't figure out what it means. She says she read all of the books written by the Arbinger Institute, and here's what she learned from them. I truly came to learn that I was in charge of my attitude, my temper, my anger, and my kids had no power over me anymore, or at least I try. Our ego is very powerful and continues to get us to believe that our children are a reflection of how good of parents we are. When we see them behaving well, we often take the credit and think that's because we really trained them well to behave. Our egos can get a little puffed up when we take the credit and when we should be giving God all the praise and glory. So Melanie has spent pages and pages telling us how the root problem in her relationship with her child was that she lacked self-control, but now she wants to say it's not a parent's fault if their child is poorly behaved? To be clear, I don't agree with either of these positions, and I think it's foolish to try to make parents or children solely responsible for a child's behavior. But what I'm noticing here is that Melanie is unable to see the ways in which her thinking contradicts itself. Instead of reading all these religious parenting books, she should have been reading the big book of logical fallacies. It feels really nice when our children obey us and make good choices. But how do we feel about ourselves when they decide to make bad choices? Do we love them any less? Do we make them feel guilty for not being the way they should? Or do we love them regardless of how they behave? Here, she asks, how do we feel about ourselves? And then asks 3 rhetorical questions about how the reader feels about their children. Her ability to say she's doing one thing while actually doing the exact opposite is blowing my mind. It's even more pronounced than it was with Chad. This is referencing God. He is so forgiving and only wants to help us, but he will not control us for us to learn that we get to choose if we want to be like him and live with him someday. Can you imagine if your child didn't want to live with you, but you forced him to? That wouldn't be very fun for either one of you. She says that God doesn't try to control us in the same chapter in which she says that God changed her heart and helped her see that sitting and squeezing her child until he submitted to her will was good parenting. And apparently she sees no contradiction between these things. This is my testimony that we can obey, that we can do it. I trust in the Lord with all my heart, and I believe in you, because God has shown me what I am capable of when I obey, and since you and I are both mortal, we both can do it because of free will and agency. Just believe. People have free will and agency, so they can choose to obey God, who gives people choices. But people shouldn't give their children choices. They should just impose their will on their kids until they break those kids, like wild horses, because Grandma and Grandpa understood how to parent better than people today do. Makes total sense. Thus ends Chapter 1. Chapter 2, A Mighty Change. I assumed that realizing God wanted her to give her kids choices, and that in order to do that she should bend them to her will, was Melanie's mighty change of heart, but apparently not. Nor does it seem like things with her kids improved much after she took 80 hours of parenting classes and read all the Arbinger Institute's books. I was about 38 years old when I had a breakdown. My youngest was about 2 at the time, and my oldest was about 8 years old. I emotionally could not handle certain people's emotions in my life. I was done. I had just read my last self-help book ever and couldn't read one more book. My mind and soul knew I couldn't help myself. I needed my God. I'm guessing when she says she couldn't emotionally handle other people's emotions, she means her kids, because if not, I don't know why she brought them up at all in the sentence before this one. In the last chapter, she went on at length about how her child's behavior bothered her. Here, she seems to be saying that her children's feelings bothered her. I assume she wasn't referencing their happiness, because parents generally aren't bothered by their kids being happy and content. My guess, and this is pure speculation, is that her kids weren't happy, and they specifically weren't happy with her. I'm basing that guess on where the rest of this story goes. And the first place it goes is Melanie's prayer closet. I had a friend who challenged me to pray 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening every day. I also read the scriptures for 2 hours each day. I decided to take the challenge because I had seen amazing spiritual changes in him. My heart was so hard, and I had nowhere to go but up at this point. So, 4 hours a day of prayer is too many. That comes to 28 hours a week. That's literally a part-time job. If you sleep 8 hours a night and spend 4 hours a day praying, that's a quarter of your waking hours. What was she doing during these prayers? Recounting the plot of Lost? At some point, a person is going to run out of things to talk about. I think most of us would have a hard time talking to anyone for 4 hours a day. Maybe she wasn't really praying that whole time. Maybe she's counting time she spent journaling or reading spiritual books. I don't know. Maybe she's just lying. If she's not lying, and she was really on her knees praying for 4 hours a day, then this starts to feel like obsession. And I also worry about her knees. There were many times I felt I had no hope. I had no idea how this was going to end. This is one of those paragraphs where it's clear Melanie doesn't want to tell us what was actually going on. She's obfuscating. I had no idea how this was going to end. How what was going to end? Her relationship with her kids? She referenced disowning one of them in the first chapter, so maybe she really did think about how her relationship with her kids was going to end. I want to pause to talk about the word this. I usually stick to discussing texts, but something came up when I was prepping this video, and I think it's worth bringing in, especially because there are possible parallels with this example. I was watching Melanie's interview with Nate Eaton, and I noticed her word choice in a way I hadn't before. If you haven't watched this interview, it's important to know that Melanie Gibb isn't a great liar. I have sympathy. I'm a terrible liar. That's part of why I try not to lie. But Melanie does things like close her eyes while saying things that aren't true. Entire sentences. That's part of how she got the nickname Melanie Fib. Now, keep in mind that this interview with Nate Eaton was conducted in May of 2020. I think they filmed it outdoors because of the pandemic. At that time, the children hadn't been found in Chad's backyard yet. We had no idea where they were, only that they hadn't been seen in more than 6 months. According to Melanie, she didn't know where they were either. If everything Melanie says is true, she had no idea what had happened to JJ at the point that she gave this interview. I'm going to play a clip now.
So she tells you all these things. You're kind of like, he looks normal to me, looks like normal JJ.
Yeah.
Did it worry you at all that, oh no, look what happened when Charles became a zombie? Something might happen to him?
I didn't think she would do that because that's her boy, you know?
I didn't think she'd do that. Do what, Melanie? Her use of that is referential, and we don't know what it references, but Melanie does. If she didn't, she wouldn't have said that. She would have said, I didn't think she'd do anything to him, or I didn't think she'd do something to him. She would have chosen a word that conveys ambiguity. But Melanie is using that as a pronoun here. And to quote the Cambridge Dictionary's website, we use that to refer back to something that has already been spoken or written about. I thought maybe it was a slip of the tongue or poor wording, even though this isn't a mistake I think I've ever heard anyone else make. But she does it twice more in this interview. This one is when she's describing how Chad called her and asked her to lie to the police and say that JJ was with her.
And I just knew something was wrong, but I didn't know. I didn't understand. Like, you know, when you believe your friends are good people, you couldn't believe that they could do something like that.
And then she says that Lori called her an hour or two later.
I wanted to believe her. I didn't want to think that she would do anything like that. I really, really wanted to believe her.
I've gone over these clips repeatedly to try to figure out what else she could have been referencing when she used a word that, and I can't find a convincing alternative. My mother suggested that maybe she was referencing what happened to Charles, as in, I never thought Lori would do to JJ what she did to Charles, but it doesn't make sense in context. The only realistic alternative possibility I could come up with is that the interview got cut in such a way that the thing Melanie was referencing when she said that got removed 3 times. It's not a strong alternative, but anything is possible. My suspicion, however, is that she knew. So when I reread this sentence in chapter 2, I had no idea how this was going to end. It gave me pause, because now I know there's a good chance that Melanie uses ambiguous language to hide things. I have no idea what she was hiding in this case, other than something to do with her own kids. Farther down in the same paragraph, she writes, "All my life I knew the gospel of Jesus Christ was true, but I didn't really believe it." Something isn't adding up here. She knew the gospel of Jesus Christ was true, but she didn't believe it? Those are the same things. How can you do one or not the other? Continuing, I didn't understand how it all worked. I read, I thought I believed, but why am I in so much pain then? This implication that if you have faith in God, you'll never suffer again is ridiculous. I don't think any legitimate spiritual leader of any faith is going to agree with that. The only person I would know of who would even say such a thing is Chad Daybell, which probably makes sense given that Melanie was a member of his cult at the time she wrote this. She says that she spent 3 months doing the 4 hours of prayer a day, but admits that these prayers were just long complaints to God. I'm almost as appalled that she was spending 4 hours a day complaining as I was that she was spending 4 hours a day praying. And I live in a home where the rule is it's always acceptable to complain. She even says she was convinced that God would take her side, which suggests she was complaining about people. Presumably, again, her kids. She thought God would take her side against her kids. I don't know exactly what her kids had done, but it's quite an assumption. Then she read in the scriptures that she was responsible for her own thoughts, words, and actions, and this was a huge revelation to her. Then I decided, since I haven't been feeling the Spirit while complaining, maybe I should start being accountable. It sounds like she went from complaining about others to complaining about herself. She actually includes a paragraph as an example of the types of things she was saying while praying, and they're fairly interesting. It sounded something like this. Father, I was mean today. I'm so sorry. How did Jesus do it? He loves us so much, and he suffered so much for me because of my ignorance, selfishness, pride. I had to be right to feel justified for being mean. Why am I judging my fellow man so much? What is it about me that I don't love, that I need to judge another? How did I become so selfish and want people to show up perfect for me? Father, I truly am lower than the dust. I want to give up all my sins to know thee. How? I'm so sorry. Please help my heart to be broken and my spirit contrite. I need thee. I cannot do this alone. She prayed like this for 4 hours a day for 6 months. I guess that's what it took for her to realize that sometimes she's the problem. With tears and love beyond what I can express to you, my cold heart started breaking. I was truly sad about my unkindness because I started feeling his love as I saw my sin, as I confessed to him my weaknesses. How could he love me when I have sinned so much? Why would a God come down to this dark world and save me? Because of love. Every morning I knelt in sacredness to my Father and continued to confess my sins, my weaknesses. I don't think this is healthy. Locking yourself in a closet and thinking about what a piece of crap you are for 4 hours a day isn't healthy. That's no way to bookend your days. At this point, she got very fixated on repentance. I'm going to go ahead and fix the typo in this sentence. I started having some amazing prayers. I would just weep when I thought of how unkind I was, and then I thought of how selfless the Savior was when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane for me. Yeah, a good prayer is one in which you focus so much on what a terrible person you are that you start bawling. She tells this story. One particular time, I woke up early as usual and went downstairs to pray. On my knees I went, but I wasn't feeling the Spirit. I said to myself, why can't I feel the Spirit? The thought came, review yesterday in your mind. She thinks back on the day before. Apparently she had taken a man some food at his home, presumably through church or Meals on Wheels, something like that, and she took one of her kids with her. Her kid misbehaved, and the old man to whom she was taking food yelled at the child and flicked a toy out of his hand. Just as I was leaving, he yelled at my kid who was acting up and flicked a toy out of his hand. My feelings were hurt. I felt ashamed, embarrassed, and then angry. In my mind, I said to myself, you are such a jerk. Here I bring food to you and you don't even say thank you. I quickly left, and all the way home I was venting inside my mind. I was mad at my kids for their bad behavior as well. Yeah, that's why she can't feel the Spirit. All it takes for God to withdraw his comfort is for you to call someone a jerk. In your mind. It's amazing how much Chad and Melanie's idea of God resembles coercive control. If you do one tiny thing that God doesn't like, you're cut off from his presence. And that includes your thoughts. Melanie talks to a friend about how Jesus suffered for her, And then she gets back in the prayer closet. After that conversation, I woke early the next morning and went downstairs to an empty bedroom and poured my soul unto God for all my sins. I could feel them all. I could feel my nothingness. I could feel sorrowful for all that I had ever done. As I wept and wept and wept, I felt peace and love completely without any judgment. It left my soul full of light and peace. It was the most powerful prayer I ever had up unto that point in my life about repentance and sorrow. Is she saying that she'd left a bunch of stuff out the first time she spent 6 months confessing her sins? That was 728 hours of confession. What could she possibly have left to confess to? I don't think it would have taken Joseph Mengele that long to confess. Anyway, now she's finally getting real about what an awful person she is. So God's willing to love her and great things happen. Something happened that was so big, so amazing, my soul will never forget. I was finally able to feel love and showed love to my husband one evening. What? Is she saying she didn't love her husband prior to this? That seems pretty wild, but that's what the words she wrote say. This, apparently, was the mighty change she underwent. The love thing, and developing psychic powers, of course. The amount of light I felt throughout my whole soul had filled in all the negative dark spots of my body. Something felt different. I had the gift of discernment. I could see the lies that I told myself so clearly now. With new eyes that were filled with light, I could see why I was suffering. I could sense my self-deception was pretty bad, full of lies. I could now sense the lack of light in others for some reason. I could see they were struggling. This sounds not dissimilar to Chad rating people's lightness and darkness. And yet it happened 8 or 9 years before Chad met Melanie, which suggests she was already primed to believe people could do that sort of thing. Each day was like living a whole new life, like I was a whole new person. I had no emotional pain, no physical pain, no worries, no complaints, no negativity. Only Christ could do something so great as this. I think the end of that sentence needs to spend a little time in the prayer closet. Like I said before, Melanie thinks that if you live in perfect obedience to God, you will be free of all suffering. And I just see no real-world evidence of that. At this point, Melanie seems to have gone from blaming everyone else to blaming herself to the most extreme form of toxic positivity. It's a shame we can't talk to her kids to see if they noticed a difference in her around this time. She knocked off the prayer closet thing and began reading the scriptures every day instead. Thanks to her new gift of discernment, she was able to understand them all so much better than before. I always feel so much hope when I read the scriptures. There is a big difference in reading truth and reading error. You never feel like a victim when you read truth. I don't know what she's getting at here. I can't recall ever having felt victimized by reading material. Not even Chad's books. I'm also getting some shades of Jodi Hildebrandt. Reading truth and reading error. I don't know. One of the great reasons why God allows us to suffer is that it gives us a reason to go to Him. If your life is going well, why would you need God? As soon as I read this, I thought of that episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia in which Dennis explains his system for getting women, and he describes how he started using a voice changer and placing threatening phone calls to the woman he was seeing in order to foster her dependence on him. That's what Melanie Gibb makes God sound like. Like an abusive boyfriend. She's still talking about God here. He empowered me to be successful in my failures and find happiness that comes from obedience to God's law. For joy comes from obedience. Jesus said it the best. If ye love me, keep my commandments. Why? Because we are free when we obey a law and are happy when we obey His commandments. Does this work for anyone besides Melanie Gibb? Is it me? Am I the only one who doesn't find joy in obeying for the sake of obeying? Am I missing out? Or is this just the sort of thing crappy parents tell their kids to get them to behave? Thus ends Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Believe in yourself. The narrative portion of the story is over. And this is the point at which the book becomes thoroughly frustrating, because Melanie is going to try to impart her spiritual wisdom. And either she can't put it into words, or she just has no wisdom. Because I found myself spending pretty much the next 10 chapters trying not to tear my hair out while shouting, "But what does that mean?" Melanie is still focused on the delights of obedience. Too often, we believe in the subtle lies of Satan, that we are nothing and can never achieve great things. How quick we are to believe lies instead of what Jesus has said about us in his holy scriptures. This is why God is so disappointed when we disobey, because he knows we can. What she appears to be saying here is that the only reason we don't want to do exactly what God tells us is because Satan has convinced us we aren't capable of it, which I think is kind of missing the point. I've never heard anyone say, I don't follow the commandments because I have low self-esteem. What I have heard people say is, no, I don't want to. Very different issues. Then she writes, when I believe in Jesus, I start believing in my ability to obey. By when I believe in Jesus, I assume she means that she has faith that Jesus died for her sins. How does believing that Jesus died for her sins shore up her belief that she's capable of obedience? I don't understand how these ideas are connected. At the end of the paragraph, she says, we need to believe in him because he is the source of all truth. So there's no objective truth. For the thousands of years people were on earth before Jesus came, no one knew anything true. What does it even mean for Jesus to be the source of truth? He only taught for 3 years. You can't tell me he managed to describe everything true in that time period. Honestly, I found this one kind of disturbing, because it sounds like Melanie is trying to redefine the word truth to mean whatever Jesus says it means. I'm not a fan of redefining the word truth. Melanie explains that we've learned our sins from our parents. Great prose there. And then encourages the reader to ask themselves deep, introspective questions like, why does everything seem so hard to do? And why do I react to everything that is hard in my life? Very insightful. These kinds of questions make you look deep inside your soul. I have often said, why does everything seem so hard for me? I don't think anyone proofread this book. Not even Chad. Maybe not even Melanie. Honestly, she might have just typed this out and then gone for it. Well, I concluded that I just didn't know how to do a lot of things. So since no one was going to show me, I thought I would start asking around. From cookbooks to parenting class to self-help books was my beginning. I figured everyone knew more than me, so I kept searching and asking. I began to learn more about me by how I handled my inadequacies. I learned I was a pretty good victim. I was angry, mad, and frustrated. But I also learned that being a victim was a hopeless way of living, and so I decided I couldn't do that anymore. Being a victim is not a choice. That's the entire meaning of the word victim, that something was done to you and you didn't have the power to change it or stop it. There's no shame in being a victim. What Melanie seems to be talking about is having a victim mentality, which means blaming other people for your problems. It's kind of an important distinction, but I probably shouldn't be surprised at this point that Melanie doesn't make it. It was just too painful to wake up every morning in pain. Hating your life, hoping others would somehow help. That's when things started stepping up for me. Everything started getting harder and harder. Now the real me started showing up. The fight in me started coming out. I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of losing. I wanted to believe the truths Jesus spoke, but I didn't know how. And she's never going to explain how either. It's an ongoing problem in this book, as is the issue of her sort of moving back and forth in time. Like, here, it appears that she's already undergone this mighty change of heart and learned how to obey, and now she doesn't suffer emotionally or anything. But then this excerpt, she says that she's very angry and frustrated, and it isn't clear if those things were sequential, or it's not really clear at all. She just kind of says whatever's on her mind, I think. On the next page, she complains that she has endured a lifetime of pain and also uses 21 exclamation points. There are a lot of almost unbelievably bad sentences in this chapter. Here are a few of my favorites. When identifying the incorrect thoughts by taking accountability, you will begin to see more of your sins than another person's sins. We don't have time to watch TV, video games, shop continually, play and spend time carelessly. The greatest way I believe I am learning who I really am is by obeying and giving my will over to God. I don't know what that means. She writes more about judgment and how we're accountable to God for our thoughts. She says that after her mighty change of heart, she began receiving downloads from Spirit. Chad gets text messages. Melanie gets whole downloads. God would use these downloads to tell her to stop judging people, which actually seems like the kind of message that would fit neatly in a text. He would often tell me that they were on their own journey, and I love them even though they are imperfect. This was helping me to see them differently. Overcoming judgment was incredibly hard for me, and when I didn't judge, I felt more peaceful inside my soul and could keep the Holy Ghost with me longer when I didn't judge. Judging others does not help you progress, neither does it help you discover who you are. It actually damns you. It holds you back from receiving more truth and knowledge. I think I've mentioned before that I believe one of the issues causing the most difficulty in our society is a refusal to acknowledge and engage with complexity. People very much want things to be black and white. This person is good, this person is bad. We crave the dichotomy of good and evil because it's simple and it's certain and it makes the right decision easy to identify. The problem is it's an illusion and it breaks down under the slightest scrutiny. Here, Melanie says that God doesn't approve of us judging people. If I'm sitting at a bus stop at 2 a.m, how close should I let the guy with the knife come before I'm allowed to judge that he's a threat? We judge people for very good reasons. Is this friend a good influence? Is this potential partner compatible? Is this woman somebody I'd like to work for? Is this dog a good fit for our family? Does this milk smell off? Yes, there are unhealthy, unkind, unreasonable types of judgments. And there are people who will judge others because of their appearance or their favorite movie or their hobbies. And it's good for us to question whether or not we're being mean-spirited. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because if Melanie Gibb had been less afraid that God would consider her judgmental and withdraw the Holy Ghost from her presence, she might have had the strength of character to save 3 lives. Thus ends chapter 3. Chapter 4, Our Thoughts. She begins this chapter by talking about how our thoughts can affect how we feel about our lives. The Arbinger Institute must have touched on basic cognitive behavioral therapy at some point. This leads to a very weird story from her childhood. I can recall learning from my father how to react to things that I bumped into or dropped that may have inflicted pain upon me. I would yell, slam doors, and just felt angry inside. I love feeling the spirit, but after doing this for most of my life, I got tired of inanimate objects controlling me and driving the spirit away, leaving me feeling horrible inside. Because of this anger, I would then take it out on my family. I started slowly changing by stating in my mind that the objects were not trying to hurt me. I decided not to react anymore and let go of the negative emotion. The more I did this, the easier it got. When my kids dropped or broke something, I would just pick it up and say, "Oh, that's okay, I'll clean that up." Or I would just choose not to say anything at all and clean it up. They were so sweet and would apologize quickly. She's really killing me with the scare quotes. I don't think this is a strange thing for a child to do, this blaming of inanimate objects, but I'm perplexed that Melanie kept doing it as an adult, to the point that she would take her rage out on her family. Apparently it's a thing some people struggle with, at least according to the internet, and I'm again going to put on my speculation hat while I guess that people who do this are the type who struggle with anger in general, and inanimate objects are just a convenient target. It's probably safer and easier than getting angry at human beings, so maybe it suggests a reluctance to confront others directly. I've always been fascinated by the phone call that Melanie recorded between herself and Lori and Chad. I call it the Korihor call, because Melanie accuses Lori of being like Korihor, who was an antichrist in the Book of Mormon, and Lori loses it. That was the first big piece of Daybell evidence that I ever heard, and I remember thinking, these people are speaking a foreign language, because the entire argument is conducted in religious quotations and references. If you listen to that call, you'll hear that Melanie is very awkward when she tries to confront Chad and Lori. She beats around the bush instead of just saying, "Where is JJ and why did you tell the cops he's with me?" She's very passive-aggressive, and that's what all the scripture quoting is about. It's a way of criticizing Chad and Lori without doing it directly, because she doesn't have the guts to do it directly. What I'm getting from all of this is an idea that Melanie is the kind of person who has difficulty confronting people and doesn't know how to do so in a healthy, straightforward, honest manner. Instead, she blows up at people, like her kids, or at inanimate objects. Either way, she blows up at things or people she has power over. This impression is strengthened by this next quote. I started noticing I would yell a lot at my kids if they behaved badly. There was no peace for me as long as I had children, which meant I was letting my circumstances and people in my life control me. I basically had no power. The people in my life and everything surrounding my life had all the power. How can a person change when they have been programmed right from birth how to respond to negative circumstances in their life? She comes back to this idea that she didn't know any better repeatedly, and the idea that she's responsible for her behavior as an adult is this huge revelation. The idea that her thoughts might influence her perceptions is shocking to her. She really comes off as naive here. Before the chapter ends, there's one other story worth reading. We have to learn to forgive no matter how hard. My good friend Lori had 2 little children who were being R-worded by her husband, their dad. After leaving him and fighting for custody for years, the Lord inspired her to forgive him. Can you imagine that conversation with the Spirit? Really, she thought. No way. The Lord changed her heart after going to the temple each week and reading and praying a lot. She was also baptized with fire, and her heart was healed and changed forever. She decided to accept the Spirit telling her to forgive him. As hard as it was, she asked him if they could meet, and she said, I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive me for my part. She felt free, as if a burden was lifted. The Lord took it all away. She stands today as a witness as well that Christ can change you. She is a sure witness of his divine grace. There's a recording of Lori giving testimony during a meeting at Melanie's house, and she testifies to the first part of this story, but she doesn't say anything about having forgiven Joe Ryan. I went back and listened to it again to make sure. According to Lori, she went to her bishop and told him she was either going to get her temple recommend or kill her ex-husband. So he gave her a temple recommend. And then Joe Ryan still died mysteriously. By the way, authorities didn't find any evidence that Joe Ryan was ever inappropriate with a child. That may well have been something Lori made up in order to try to get full custody of Tylee. Thus ends Chapter 4. Chapter 5, Opposition. Opposition is one of the most central concepts in Mormonism. It's that whole, if it never rains, you won't appreciate the sunshine thing. But it extends to the idea that everything in the universe has an opposite. How can we choose good over evil if we don't know what evil is? Despite what an interesting idea this is, though, Melanie doesn't actually write much about it. She does tell this story. I met a man once who told me about opposition in such a unique way. He said when Bruce Lee first trained in martial arts, he first only blocked. But after a while, he got tired of being hit, so he decided to dodge the punches by just moving to avoid getting hit. He then said when opposition comes, we just get out of the way and not let us get hit by it. As I pondered that for months, I thought the answer seemed so easy. I realized I wasn't going to stop my opposition by reacting to it. I was going to stop my opposition by not responding to it. By seeing my opposition as a blessing, it gives me the power now to act in righteousness instead of acting in unrighteousness. Melanie is confusing reacting with reactivity here. Dodging a punch is absolutely a reaction. Ignoring someone is a reaction. She never mentions the difference between responding from righteousness and unrighteousness, and never explains what that means. I guess if we respond unrighteously today, God will let us know tomorrow by refusing to let us feel the Spirit. Understanding Melanie Gibb requires that you understand this story, because this is central to how she goes about her life. She really does believe that the only way to stop her opposition is by not responding at all. And she's going to apply that to every area of her life. Most of us have a problem with this, and it is because we think, I can't let someone treat me like that, or they can't get away with that, or I have to stand up for myself. The scriptures will disagree with this type of thinking. As I mentioned before, Melanie has trouble with black and white thinking. The options she presents here are to get defensive or pretend not to react at all. There's no mention of standing up for oneself without getting defensive, which is absolutely appropriate and possible. The only other excerpt from this chapter I want to discuss is this one. Sometimes we think, if they would stop acting that way, I will finally be happy and not react. What a joke. Many of us actually believe that someone else changing is going to make us happy or cause us not to react to negative behaviors anymore. In one of Melanie's police interviews, she tells a story about how she felt her ex-husband spoke to her in a demeaning way. So she divorced him.
So then I said, and then anyway, I had a hard day one day with Brendan, and I told him months, like right about the time I met Lori, I remember standing with my husband, and I said to him, if you don't stop talking to me this way, I can't do it anymore. You're going to have to make some changes. I mentally, I can't talk. I can't handle the way you talk to me anymore. I can't do it. And I remember he has this scratching thing. He just started scratching his arm with his eczema. And I was, and then we had a discussion once, and I said, you see how you're talking to me? I said, that's the meaning. Do you understand that? He goes, that is? And I go, yeah, it is. I'm just trying to figure out, you know, he always had his reasons. And then, anyway, so I went out for a walk one day, and I just said, do I have to stay in this marriage, Heavenly Father? I can't do this anymore. It hurts my mind at this point.
I'm not saying she shouldn't have. If he really spoke to her in a demeaning way on an ongoing basis, that's not okay. And I'm not advocating for people to stay in toxic relationships. I'm just pointing out that her telling a story about 2 occasions on which she confronted her husband about speaking to her this way, and telling him she would divorce him if he didn't change, kind of cuts the legs out from under this excerpt in her book. Thus ends Chapter 5. Chapter 6, Surrendering. I'm going to say from the start that I think Melanie is using the wrong word here. This doesn't have anything to do with surrender. When a person surrenders, they no longer are thinking of their needs anymore. They are thinking of others. When a person surrenders, they have to surrender to something. Based on this excerpt, she seems to be using the word surrender to mean focusing on others instead of ourselves. But we don't really have a verb for that in English. Also, it's not healthy to never think of your own needs. It doesn't matter, though, because none of that is what Melanie really wants to talk about. I have often thought, if they would just treat me right and talk the way I would like them to talk to me, I would be happy. What if they would clean my house and fulfill my love languages? Then I would be happy. If they were like so-and-so, then I would be happy. I have found this lie to be so very damning. We are truly damned, meaning we cannot move forward or upward. So we're back to Melanie not liking the way her husband talked to her, and the absurd idea that the only thing in life that can make us happy or unhappy is our obedience to God. Nothing else matters. I thought that if I cried unto the Lord about my problems, he would somehow feel sorry for me and make me feel better. Wrong. He doesn't quite work like that. Why? Because he wants you to have faith in him and believe in his Son. God doesn't care if we're miserable. God only cares if we believe in his Son. What does it mean to believe in Jesus? That isn't a question I ever thought of asking until I read this book, but now it bothers me greatly because I'm not sure we can choose to believe in something. We can choose to trust in something. We can choose to hope for something. But belief is an intellectual conclusion we draw. It isn't something we can choose to do. Then Melanie goes off about how we shouldn't ask God to lower his standards for us, which is just a strange premise to begin with. I'm trying to imagine what form such a request could take, but it just sounds silly. Like, dear God, having 10 commandments is too hard. Can you cross 2 of them out? I'll let you pick. If this takes a more recognizable form, I don't know what it is. I got this impression this morning as I watched my husband swim through water. As he was gliding beautifully through the water, I sensed he was swimming with complete surrender. I then said to him, "You know, surrendering to God is like swimming for you. You are so connected to the water as you swim with ease, knowing how to work with the water instead of resisting it. You didn't fight it, you knew how to let go and enjoy the water." There was a little boy in the water struggling to swim near him, and I could sense he didn't understand yet how to swim and be a part of the water. He made it look so hard to swim. He was still learning how it all worked. It was interesting to watch my husband as he glided through the water with ease, and then watched this little boy struggle as he was learning. What a great example Father showed me. Example of what? What does this mean? If you surrender to the water in a pool, you drown. Is God the water or the air? At the beginning of the chapter, she said that when we surrender, we only think about others and quit thinking about ourselves. So if her husband was so good at surrendering, why wasn't he thinking about that kid who couldn't swim instead of just getting his laps in? The next story doesn't make much more sense than this one. To be clear, there are 2 friends mentioned in this story, the one Melanie is in conflict with, and the one who suggests the inner child work, a suggestion Melanie seems to completely ignore. I once shared with a friend of mine about some struggling I was going through with a friend. She said it would be helpful to go to my inner child and help heal her. So I set out that morning on a walk to try to find some relief. As I walked, I prayed out loud. I prayed for this friend that I could love her and could have empathy for her. Still suffering, I knelt down in the middle of the field and said, I believe in Jesus. He said, Matthew 11:28-30, Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I just decided to believe what he said. I handed it over. I chose to believe instead of suffer. I knew I couldn't fix that person, but he could fix my heart if I let him. All my pain was gone. I no longer needed to dwell on the pain of not getting what I wanted to have from this person. It was gone. I was free. I felt more compassion for this person instead. I prayed for her instead of wanting something from her. Over and over in this book, God and Jesus fix things in a way that doesn't make sense. Whatever the problem is, Melanie declares that she's a believer, and the problem goes poof. Let's play, well, not devil's advocate, given the topic, Let's play atheist's advocate. I can't say that this never happened to Melanie, but if this really worked, wouldn't everyone be doing it? She's essentially treating Jesus like a worry doll. There's something here, and I'm not sure what to call it, if it's avoidance or denial or displacement, but she clearly can't engage with her own emotions in the way I would expect an adult woman to be able to do. She's described 2 responses to personal conflict: blaming others and prayer. Either it's her child's fault she's upset, or else she needs to pray so God will make it go poof. She continues, often the scriptures talk about having gratitude. Stop for a moment and reflect upon what you're struggling with. Imagine kneeling and pouring your soul unto your Father in heaven and thanking him for the struggle. Sing if you need to, if the pain is so bad. Singing brings a new feeling into your soul that helps draw you closer to the Spirit. Find a way to praise God in your worship time. I am not a fan of our culture's current worship of gratitude. If it works for people, great, but it doesn't work for me. I think that you can acknowledge the growth you've achieved or the lessons you've learned from a difficult experience without forcing yourself to feel gratitude for it. Melanie disagrees. According to her, I should have spent the last 10 days thanking God for my bronchitis because I've been taking breathing for granted lately or something. I don't know. It's passages like these that make me think Melanie is the queen of toxic positivity. Years ago, I read something about gratitude. I think it was a random religious tract that we got in the mail. And it had all these ways to practice gratitude. I remember one example was, if you get a parking space that's far away from the business you're visiting, be grateful, because that means you have legs and can walk. I feel like Melanie is trying to force gratitude in the same way. I see very little in this book about taking practical steps to address problems. She sort of tried it with the parenting classes she took over and over, although I'm pretty sure that class was offered by the church. And then she read a lot of books, but her point about the classes and the books were that they didn't help her in the way she needed, that she had to resort to the prayer closet and reciting an endless litany of her sins. It feels like Melanie thinks that introspection is only useful within the context of religion. Ponder this question. What is it you want from other people? Their love, understanding, time, patience, affection, to be heard, to vent, more knowledge, to control, to manipulate, to satisfy your carnal desires, or to enslave? Our whole goal in life is not to get something from another person. It is to follow the Savior and become like our Father in heaven. So it's not what you want from others, it's what you should be for others. I have to point out how bizarre it is that she appears to equate wanting someone's affection with wanting to enslave them, with wanting them to understand you, with wanting them to fulfill your carnal desires. She seems to be saying that wanting anything from another person is wrong. And that's bonkers. I have come to understand why we struggle with this idea of other people making us happy. It is because we are lacking love in our own hearts. We are not connected to the divine source of all love. The love we want is not something another person can give us, because God's love is without end and a love without expectations. In case it isn't apparent yet, Melanie's thinking tends toward extremes. She's completely bought into the idea of Jesus plus nothing. You might ask, how do you know this? From experience. When you are a wife, mother, sister, and a friend, you have people that want things from you. But I didn't seem to be able to accomplish this very well. I didn't have that kind of love. I didn't know how to love the irritating behavior, the victim, the needy, the liar, the controller, the tantrum thrower, the mentally ill. But I found someone that could. Jesus. So here, she can't get past her negative feelings toward other people. And instead of contemplating what about her might be holding her back or leading to her irritation, she's just going to let Jesus deal with them. It seems like Jesus is doing the heavy lifting in a lot of Melanie's relationships, and I wonder how the people around her feel about that. But what about those who are upset because their needs are not being met? They are so offended because they are not getting the love they think they should get as a spouse or a child. Can you see the problem in this? I talked about this in another chapter. When we rely upon another person to make us happy, we are damned. When someone else is responsible for our happiness, we have lost power. Surrender having to be loved and let the Lord fill you with his love, and that will be more than enough. Is she saying that her kids were wrong to expect her to love them? That is the first time I've gotten that from reading this section, but now I think that might be what she's saying. She definitely says that we can't make our happiness dependent on someone else. But then she also says that God can fulfill all our needs, and somehow she doesn't see that she's contradicting herself again. I keep thinking about this weird thing with her kids. It's really distracting to me now. Honestly, making your happiness dependent on God isn't much better than making it dependent on other people. Again, anytime Melanie is faced with conflict in interpersonal relationships, she negates the entire issue and goes back to obsessing over God and telling herself that she doesn't need anything or anyone. And now I'm suspecting that she also does that when anyone wants anything from her. I'm going to read one more excerpt, not because it's especially interesting, but because I want to point out how completely contradictory the next chapter is. Let us commit ourselves completely to the Lord and give our wills unto him. He can do miracles with our crazy lives than we ever can on our own. Let him in so he can change you. Give our wills unto him. It sounds like she thinks we should have no will of our own and just let God use us like puppets because he can do more with our lives than we can. Thus ends chapter 6. Chapter 7, Who's in Charge? When I am feeling like I have no hope in the world, this is what I say. Who is in charge? Who is at the helm? One day during summer break, it was me and my 4 little boys struggling to get along. We were a mess. I sat there at the kitchen table and said to myself, "Who's in charge, Melanie?" I replied, "I'm the captain of this ship, and they are going down." Somebody had to be in charge, and I was so tired of letting them be in charge. I pulled up my big girl pants and decided to take back the helm, so to speak. We ended up having a pretty good summer. So, did you not read the last paragraph of chapter 6, Little Miss Puppet of God? You can't be in charge because God's in charge. I find Melanie, and a lot of religious zealots, frankly, frustrating because their extremeness refuses to deal with practical issues. Let's say you turn your life over to God. You subvert your will to his. You get up in the morning. You spend 2 hours in your prayer closet listing all the sins you've committed recently. And then, what? What happens? Is God going to show up and tell you how to spend your day? He's supposed to be using your life to perform miracles. So when does that start? Are you allowed to ask your partner to drive the kids to school, or is that wanting someone from someone else? Are you allowed to eat breakfast, or is that feeding carnal desires? If your kids ask for a hug, do you hug them? Or do you tell them that they shouldn't want affection from other people and they need to get that from God? This kind of religious extremism is infuriating, and it breaks down under the slightest scrutiny, because this isn't how God works. And I'm not saying that in the sense of, my personal feelings are that this isn't how God works. This literally isn't how God works. You can't give up all will to God and expect him to take over for you. Life isn't a car God borrows. If someone said to me, I got up this morning and God told me to have a protein shake, and then the oil in my car changed and return my overdue library books, I would tell them to seek professional help. Even Chad wasn't stupid enough to try to argue this. Even he realized that you can't refuse to act unless you get a prompting. For Melanie to advocate giving up all will to God, and then start a new chapter and declare herself the captain of the ship, demonstrates a profound lack of critical thinking. There's no indication of when this summer of fun took place, but it sounds like she was continuing to have the exact same problems parenting that she was before. She keeps saying that God fixed everything for her, and then accidentally revealing that her problems weren't really fixed. I don't know if she's lying or if she just can't manage enough introspection to notice that her problems are continuing just like before. She does it again farther down the page. As I was sitting down this morning with my son, I told him it was up to him to finish his classes. He cannot blame his brothers, me, or anyone else, and that he was completely in control. I told him, can you imagine you go through life as a victim and blame everyone for your failures? Can you imagine saying things like, it's my dad's fault because I didn't finish school, or it's my mom's fault I failed? I told him that is a victim mentality, and victims are never happy and can never progress. I explained how sad that would be, to go through life like that. It's like a TV talk show where everyone on there is a victim. Their life is pure hell. You can never take responsibility for yourself when you blame another person. You lose power. When I say, my parents didn't teach me how to cook healthy, I could easily go into the victim mode and blame them for my bad health forever. But how will that help me? I just damns me and I cannot progress. I assume that's a typo in the last sentence. Melanie has a real problem with people who have victim mentalities. What I think is most interesting about this excerpt is that she doesn't say, if your parents didn't teach you to cook, take cooking classes. She says it's up to her to find health and happiness while walking the path with God. Why are we bringing God into this? She doesn't need a miracle, just an introductory cookbook. Not everything has to come back to God. The older I get, the more I become a huge fan of moderation. The only thing I'm extreme about is moderation. Spirituality is a wonderful, enriching, life-affirming thing for many of us. That doesn't mean it should become everything. I remember this funny line in a book on witchcraft I read in middle school. I'm paraphrasing, but it went something like, always use common sense about when to employ witchcraft. For example, if someone cuts their leg and is bleeding badly, take them to the ER. Don't attempt a coagulation spell. That has stuck with me for 30 years, because it's really smart advice, and someone should give it to Melanie Gibb. Part of being in charge is to know what you want. I didn't for a long time know what I wanted and liked. I spent all my life watching TV, letting someone else decide what I was going to watch each day and how I was going to let them program my mind and beliefs. My mind became so conditioned to letting others entertain me. Of course, I didn't know what I liked or didn't like. I hadn't experienced very much. I know this sounds pretty sad, but unfortunately this was my life. No, it sounds like you have a victim mentality. Which is maybe her point, I'm not really sure. This is a strange passage, and I can't figure out how literally to take it. Is she saying that someone else always had the remote? Or that all programmed television is someone else deciding what we want to watch? I'm flummoxed by her statement that she didn't know what she liked or disliked. Was she never given choices as a child? Were her choices ignored? She seems to mean this part quite literally, if the following sentences are any indication. As my life became more and more challenging, I started having little breakdowns along the way. I did learn something that was really valuable during those breakdowns, and this was it. I started to learn what I didn't like. That was huge. She then lists things she didn't like. feeling sick, her kids' behavior, being a victim to the moods of others, and also being a victim. No one likes being a victim, so I'm not really sure how much she discovered. I'm concerned by the fact that she's saying she had children before she had the self-awareness to even know what TV shows she disliked or liked. One of the fastest ways I started taking my life back was I stopped watching TV. Yes, I gave it up. It was amazing how much time I had and what I actually did with my life. Melanie is very proud of the fact that she gave up television. Except that we know she didn't, because she slips up in various interviews and references things she saw on TV. She's too virtuous to watch TV, even though she does. When I sin and don't repent, I really do suffer. Anytime I hold a grudge and don't forgive, I feel anger, disappointment, grief, depression, and on and on. These are all negative emotions, and why do we fall for it? These emotions are dark and heavy and have no light or joy. How do we get rid of it? So having negative emotions is a sin now? Seriously? If your mom dies and you feel grief, apparently that means you've fallen for it. She compares these emotions to addictions, and you can probably guess what she recommends. Expressing gratitude to Father in prayer is the best way to handle these challenges. It puts your heart into a more humble and broken place. Stop what you are doing and think of someone that is bothering you. Now, take those emotions to Father and let him know how grateful you are for those challenges with that person. If your heart is really broken, you will want to cry and praise him for allowing you to experience these challenges. This is starting to sound flat out unhinged. It sounds like Melanie can't handle normal human emotions. She never explains why we should thank God for our challenges, or how this will help us, or how God will respond. Other than the deliciousness of having a broken heart. I love helping people, but I didn't understand the line of helping and enabling. When a person is down in the hole, I would often jump down there to help them try to find a way out. What ended up happening is I would get dirty when I would get down there and help them. What I have learned to do is to tell them from the top of the hole, "This man beside me is Jesus Christ, and he can help you. He helped me. Why don't you try asking him to help you too? I know he can, because he helped me overcome all my struggles." I know this is a metaphor, but my suspicion is that this is how Melanie actually responds when people tell her about their problems. I'm betting the only solution she ever offers is some variation on locking oneself up in a prayer closet. I think the word I want to use to describe Melanie's behavior is abdicate. She just decides that nothing is her responsibility, which is pretty ironic, given that this chapter is supposed to be about taking charge. Instead, Jesus can deal with it. Make up your mind and decide, do you want to be happy and full of joy or suffer? We can choose eternal life or hell. We have to be willing to give up everything we want, because you will never get what is yours that is not to be had. Giving everything over to Christ is the only way to happiness, joy, and love. To give yourself away is to be finally connected to him, becoming one, letting go of the natural and letting the spiritual take over. The only way to be happy is to give up and vacate your own life. This is the spiritual equivalent of Cartman saying, "Screw you guys, I'm going home." Jesus isn't an out. He isn't a way to avoid dealing with your problems. And telling someone to pray doesn't absolve you of responsibility toward them. Melanie seems to think that everything is above her pay grade, but nothing is below Jesus's pay grade. Melanie's incapable, so Jesus has to take care of everything. Thus ends chapter 7. Chapter 8, I single to the glory of God. That phrase comes from LDS scripture. Melanie starts off talking about how when we've reduced ourselves to heartbroken, blubbering messes, we start losing the desire to sin. When we are that focused on the Lord in our time of worship, reading his scriptures, and attending the temple, we receive more and more light. Music arranged by Annette Dickman. Yeah, there's a random music arrangement attribution at the bottom of this page. I looked Mrs. Dickman up, and she seems to have written a number of LDS hymns, some of which made it into the most recent hymnal. On the next page are the lyrics to a hymn called Take Time to Be Holy. The lyrics to each verse are just in a block paragraph. Melanie didn't even include the title of the hymn, I just guessed it based on the lyrics. Each line begins with Take Time to Be Holy, so, it wasn't hard to figure out. What I find most frustrating is that Mrs. Dickman didn't write the lyrics. William D. Longstaff did. And the music Mrs. Dickman arranged isn't in here. Plus, the attribution is on a different page than the lyrics. It's just chaos formatting. I was really starting to notice after giving up the TV and movies that I had been neglecting the Lord and the time I serve him. The programming that happens to your mind is huge when you engage in those shows. I'm not saying all movies are bad, because I still enjoy a good spiritual movie, but most movies are not worth watching and are not important to your eternal salvation. Have I mentioned previously that I think Melanie might have some obsessive tendencies? I'm coming to realize as I read these books, not just hers, but Chad's and Jason Mau's and Julie Rowe's, how much crazy behavior we overlook because it's religious in nature. Like, if Melanie were obsessed with anything other than Jesus, anything other than religion, we would be telling her this isn't healthy. If we replace every mention of Jesus and God in this book with giant sloth, think of how absurd it would all sound. No, I can't help you get out of this hole, but maybe this giant sloth can. I've decided to quit watching TV so I'd have more time to read about giant sloths. Every time I have an unkind thought, I humble myself before the giant sloth. We make such allowances for religion, and I think that's often reasonable, but we need moderation in religion perhaps more than we need it anywhere else. The point of this chapter seems to be that we need to spend as much time as possible obsessing over God. It's a very short chapter, but toward the end we can see Laurie's influence over Melanie quite clearly. Just in the last few weeks, I started to go to the temple every day. I live 10 minutes away, which helps, but I cannot begin to tell you the difference it makes in my life. My light is increasing, and I only think of things that please the Lord, or at least I try. Does that mean all my challenges have gone away? No, I wish. I just have more power, light, and love to deal with them better. I have also noticed that the more light I have in my eyes because I'm trying to keep my eyes single to the glory of God, the more I can see the light or lack of light in others. Not trying to be judgmental, but it is something that comes with spending time in holy places. I recommend it. It will change your life. So she started going to the temple every day, just like a certain someone. And suddenly she developed the ability to perceive who was light and who was lacking light. And in the same sentence, she references standing in holy places. Now, that phrase appears multiple times in LDS scripture. Chad Daybell didn't invent it. But I don't think it's coincidence that she uses that phrase in the same sentence in which she alludes to psychically knowing whether someone is light or dark. And it stands as a reminder that Melanie was fully immersed in Chad's cult when she wrote this. Everything in it is spiritually suspect because of that association, because she was a student, dare I say, a disciple, of Chad and Laurie's. Thus ends chapter 8. Chapter 9, Born of God. This is another very short chapter, and probably close to half of it is in quotes. The chapters are getting shorter as the book goes on, which makes me think Melanie has run out of things to talk about. This book would have made a lot more sense as a personal essay. Essentially, the chapter retells the same story of her prayer closet and contrite heart and God giving her new eyes and all that. only this time she adds that the change she underwent was being born again. And until then, she didn't know she hadn't been born again already. I begin understanding that the Holy Ghost was there to sanctify me so I could stand in the presence of Jesus Christ. I didn't really understand how all that worked until I had been born of God. This is the really neat thing about being born again, is that you will be personally tutored by the Holy Ghost, so you don't need to figure it all out by yourself. He will teach you. As you pray each day, revelation begins to pour into your mind and heart. She goes on to say that most of us have been underutilizing the Holy Ghost, which is just a wild sentence. As I read this book, I began to notice that, just like Chad Daybell, Melanie takes things very literally. It's one thing to say the Holy Ghost will teach you, and another to say that the Holy Ghost will personally tutor you. In Chad's case, I felt like he was so literal because he has no imagination, but with Melanie, it seems more like a sort of desperation that all of this is real. And I'm not saying Jesus is a lie or anything like that. I'm saying I think Melanie is afraid on some level that it's all a lie. It's a methinks the lady doth protest too much kind of vibe. For example, on the last page of this chapter, after she discusses how Jesus' cleansing fire will change you, she writes, "The fire that I speak of is something very real!" Exclamation point. And variations on that sentence appear throughout this book, usually with an exclamation point at the end. I'm not sure if she doesn't trust that we'll take her word for this, or if she feels like the intangibility of God is his weakest selling point. Thus ends Chapter 9. Chapter 10, Emotional Manipulation. Emotional manipulation, by far, is one of the most deceptive ways we can not only hurt one another, but stop our eternal progression. This is when someone manipulates another person by using an emotion like crying or being angry to get what they want from them. Emotional manipulation has many faces and comes in a variety of symptoms. Melanie Gibb is neither as smart as she thinks she is, nor is she as stupid as she wants us to believe. When I was sick, I decided to revisit as many of her interviews as I could, and this moment stuck out to me.
And then I've learned more about my life, and I'm looking back at my former spouse, I'm going, oh, things I couldn't see before. And it's called deception or manipulation. I wasn't even aware of that. Like, people do that. I didn't catch it because I don't know how to do it. I don't understand it. But when you experience it, it's painful.
So she didn't understand manipulation, but she wrote an entire chapter about it with examples. Come on. Before we continue, let's define manipulation. Merriam-Webster defines it as to control or play upon by artful, unfair, or insidious means, especially to one's own advantage. The important thing is that there has to be an element of covertness or subterfuge. You're getting tricked into doing what someone else wants you to. Melanie's paragraph continues. Because we have wants and needs as human beings, we are hoping someone else can give us some of the things we want or need. Some of those needs are hunger, sleep, sex, companionship, money, housing, etc. We have needs, so we want other people to fulfill them? She uses the word because, implying a cause and effect relationship, but seems to ignore any possibility that we can fulfill even some of our own needs. Now, obviously we can't always, but I think that most of us would prefer to be able to take care of ourselves. Most of us don't enjoy needing things from other people. Is Melanie saying that she would prefer other people fulfill her needs? We start off as babies, crying to give us the things we need, because that's the only way we can communicate. We learn very quickly that when we cry, we get what we want. As we continue to grow, we continue try using this method until our parents get smarter than we are and set out some consequences for this behavior. If you are like me, you might have failed at this and your kids end up throwing tantrums a lot. Boy, has this been a hard learn. I hate this. a crying infant isn't being manipulative. Melanie's understanding of children is like a half step up from Chad's, if that. Saying that a crying child is being manipulative is incorrect. The child isn't trying to use subterfuge to get what they want. They're being quite clear about what they want, probably as clear as they know how to be. If our parents are emotional manipulators, then we learn really quickly from them how to yell or throw tantrums when we do not get what we want. This is truly sad, but I have been guilty of this behavior in the past. Why is there an exclamation point there? Once again, there's just an astonishing lack of insight here. When Melanie's kids are throwing tantrums, it's because they're being manipulative. But when she does it, it's because that's what her parents taught her. Her kids are doing it because that's what she taught them. On the next page, she gives an example of how she responded to a friend who was being emotionally manipulated. At least, according to Melanie's definition. My friend called me today complaining about her mother-in-law. As she told me about how she was hurt by her mother-in-law, the spirit helped me understand what was going on, and this is what I said to her. Your mother-in-law created a situation where you felt left out. She has used a type of emotional manipulation to get you to do what she wants you to do. She may not be aware she is doing this to you, but you do not have to respond to this type of behavior. You simply ignore the fact she left your child out of the celebration and move on as if it never happened. If you get upset, the whole family is in an uproar, and she has struck gold again and created a situation where she has power over others. We're on page 84 of a 96-page book, and at this point I feel confident in saying that Melanie Gibb thinks the best response to any given situation is no response at all. There aren't enough details here to know if this was a reasonable response to a friend's situation, but it's obvious that what Melanie is defining as manipulation is anything that causes another person to feel something. Excluding someone from a group activity is likely to hurt their feelings, but that's not manipulation. Manipulation is trying to trick someone into doing something. It doesn't sound like the mother-in-law was trying to trick Melanie's friend into doing anything at all. Here's how she concludes the story. My friend's humble response was, "Thank you so much, Melanie. You are right. I feel so much better now. I just told my husband what you said, and we are okay and do not need to be upset now." Boom! She got it. The adversary didn't win. So the friend is going to cut her mother-in-law out of her life? That's an option. It might even be an appropriate option. But it's also an option to go to the mother-in-law and say, I felt hurt when you excluded my child, and I'd like to understand better why you made that decision. Clearly, Melanie doesn't have the emotional maturity to actually face problems in her relationships. She's again demonstrating black and white thinking. The options she sees are to throw a tantrum or refuse to react. And then she says that feeling your feelings and reacting to them are the work of the adversary, which is an LDS reference to Satan. Negative feelings are the work of Satan. Melanie is going to double down on the idea that ignoring them is the best way to deal with feelings, and I assume she's speaking from experience in this excerpt. We have the power to not respond to any person's emotional manipulation or their controlling behaviors. They may not like it, but you don't need people in your life that act that way. Now, you might be married to a person like that, and most likely you will stay in that relationship. But again, you do not have to react to other people's emotions and desires to control you or anyone else. The way you combat these challenges are to simply not let them have any effect on you. So the best way to deal with a bad relationship is to deny that it makes you feel bad. That sounds super healthy, Mel. I was confused by the sentence that follows, which is the last in the paragraph. Yes, there are times when you are directed to leave for safety or mental health, but sometimes we are meant to do hard things and try to help where we can. So she's carving out exceptions for physical violence and mental health struggles, which is important. She's at least not advocating that DV victims suck it up. But what does it mean that we have to do hard things and help where we can? Based on the rest of this chapter, she appears to be admitting that it's really hard to swallow your feelings all the time. This bit about helping where you can suggests a sort of martyrdom. If you frequently feel like a martyr in your relationship, that's a problem. Melanie's husband filed for divorce in May of 2019, by the way. According to her testimony at Chad's trial, she wrote this book in 2018, but she was already getting divorced by the time she published it. There's a real element of hypocrisy here. Next, she alludes to something interesting but gives no details. I have a family member who simply doesn't like me. I have apologized for any bad behavior on my part in the past and asked for forgiveness. He simply wasn't ready to forgive, and so I had to let it go. I do not communicate with him as much as possible. I am always nice, but I make sure my emotions are always pleasant and no drama has occurred because of me. The obvious question is, what did she do that her family member couldn't forgive? We can't discount the possibility that her family member just isn't a forgiving person, but this contributes to the idea that Melanie's behavior prior to her learning how to ignore her feelings was problematic. I'm guessing she had issues with her temper, but that's mostly speculation. I finally realized something interesting about myself. I used to think if someone didn't like me, there was something wrong I was doing. I felt I needed to make it right and apologize or do something that would make them like me. Wrong. I do not have to let people hurt me or be unkind to me. I can simply walk away. I'm going to continue reading this excerpt, but I have to stop here and point out that Melanie is confusing people not liking her with people hurting her and being unkind to her. Those aren't the same thing. Note that, once again, her solution is to walk away. This was another deception of lies I was caught in. Because I am such a nice person and always wanted people to like me, I was now a victim of their moods toward me. How very slick of Satan to mislead me because of my kind heart. The Lord is about making us warriors, not victims. As an aside, she and Lori and Jason Mao were already recording a podcast called Time to Warrior Up when she wrote this. I'll talk about it more when I do Jason Mao's novels. There are only 2 episodes of the podcast still available. The rest have been scrubbed from the internet. I've been able to find the first one and the one where they interviewed Chad. If anyone has access to the other episodes, I would love to hear them. Anyway, I think it's important that Melanie places "because I was such a nice person and always wanted people to like me" together the way she does, as if being a nice person and wanting people to like her naturally go together. She rails against being a victim throughout this book, but doesn't hesitate to claim the title for herself when it suits her. Oh, poor me. My only sin was that I was too nice. I wanted people to like me. One of the most offensive things I've heard Melanie say was, and I think I referenced this earlier, during her testimony at Lori's trial when Lori's lawyer was asking her about her obvious dislike of Tylee, and she says, "I am always kind." Except when you're screaming at your kids or complaining about people for 4 hours a day or cutting people off with whom you have conflicts instead of trying to work things out with them. Look, I don't expect people to be perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. But I think we have an obligation to be honest with ourselves about our imperfections, and Melanie Gibb is not honest with herself. The problems in her relationships aren't rooted in her being too nice or in the influence of Satan. She writes a paragraph about how people don't leave situations where they're being mistreated because they're addicted to the drama. It's such a stupid and offensive and simplistic argument, and she blames Satan for that too. She's going to reference the gift of charity here. This is the first time she's mentioned it, but she seems to be saying she received it as part of her mighty change of heart. You have to make sure you are not the emotional manipulator in your family. It is so hard to see it in ourselves at times. I know I have been guilty of this behavior a lot, and once I started repenting and being accountable, everything started changing. Once the gift of charity was given to me, I had no desire to hurt another person to get what I wanted. I just wanted to love and show kindness to all. But as life would have it, I would be tried on this new gift. It has been 10 years since I received such an amazing gift from Father. I have learned a whole bunch. No one really can do this until he or she has surrendered his will over to God. And because of this, I was tested and tested until I lost all desire to manipulate for my gain. I have had to learn to ignore, walk away, be patient, continue to be accountable for myself, endure, trust in God, and develop a higher kind of love, an unconditional love. She doesn't say how she was manipulative, and her definition of manipulation is so broad as to be meaningless. I'm very curious about how she was tested. What's vital to note, however, is that she had to learn to ignore, walk away, be patient. That is Melanie's MO. And because it's a step up from losing her temper and screaming at people, she thinks she's perfect now. This is followed by 2 pages of repetitive testimony that Jesus is great and everything bad is caused by Satan, and a lot of exclamation points. Thus ends chapter 10. Chapter 11, False Traditions. From what I can tell, the idea of false traditions in LDS doctrine is any ungodly habit that parents have taught their children, ranging from religious beliefs to personal habits to attitudes and opinions. Melanie claims in this chapter that the root cause of unhappiness, pretty much all unhappiness as far as I can tell, is false traditions and false ideas that we've learned from our parents. But then she immediately contradicts that by saying that her children's false beliefs aren't her fault. It is a false idea that if my kids are not performing well in school or at sports, that somehow that is because of me. What a painful way to live. Think about it. If Billy decides to goof off in school and he gets into trouble, I need to be upset and feel like a failure. Why do we make everything about us? You have taught your child about good and evil, so why are you upset? Maybe you are feeling a little guilty because you think you didn't do a good job teaching and training your kids. We live in a society that encourages guilt about everything. Everyone seems to think that they can tell you how to raise your kids and what you should or shouldn't do with your kids. It's insane. So the question is, how do you feel peace in this type of thinking? Listen to how she absolves herself of any responsibility for her child's behavior. Well, I taught the kid about good and evil. It's not my fault if they can't sit still in class. Children are their own people, and their behavior isn't 100% a reflection of their parenting. But Melanie talks like she bears no responsibility for how her kids turned out. And then this line, why do we make everything about us? That line is manipulative. It's manipulative because if the issue is your child, then yes, you do bear partial responsibility for how they behave. Not for everything and not forever, but parents are the single biggest influence on children. And she wants to deny that because she doesn't want to feel guilt. In some ways, Melanie is a lot like Chad. More like Chad than Lori, I think. She again sets up this extreme dichotomy. Either she bears no responsibility for her children, or else she has to feel like a failure. There are oceans of possibilities between those two options. And she confuses guilt with responsibility, despite all her BS about accountability to God. How about being accountable to your kids? How about being accountable to Lori's kids? Speaking of which, I want to share a personal story about my friend Lori. While sitting in church one Sunday, she started worrying over her son, who returned home early from his mission and married a woman outside of the LDS faith. As she sat there, Jesus Christ told her this, "Why weepest thou? Don't you know I have suffered so you wouldn't have to? Your son is in my hands. You love him, and I'll lead him." She no longer worried about her son because she understood what the atonement of Jesus Christ was all about. He doesn't want us to worry, stress, or any negative emotion over things in this world. She's talking about Lori's only surviving child, Colby. Colby married a woman who is Christian but not LDS, and they have 3 children. or they soon will. I'm not sure if their last child's been born yet. If you've watched the Netflix series, you got to see a lot of Colby's wife, and she is absolutely wonderful. My impression was that she has been Colby's rock through all of this. I assume Lori's concerns were exclusively limited to the fact that she's not LDS. But getting back to Melanie's book, the idea that Jesus doesn't want anyone to ever experience any negative emotion that's just such a wild idea. I'm not even sure it was addressed in the scriptures, LDS or otherwise. But now we see how Melanie is justifying her inaction, her refusal to deal with emotions and situations and people. She expects Jesus to do it for her. She doesn't just want Jesus to take the wheel. She wants him to take over parenting, relationships, and emotional processing. She literally wants Jesus to feel for her. And I don't know what to do with that. There's a certain level on which some people seem to believe that the purpose of life is to avoid living. Like, the best way to live is to have no will of our own, right? To ignore our feelings, to hand responsibility for everything over to Jesus. In what sense is that living? Why would God send us to earth to learn to avoid doing all the things that living entails? It just makes no sense. I want to mention here that throughout this book, Melanie has included scriptures to back up her assertions. I haven't discussed them because I'm not an LDS theologian or even a Mormon, and I don't feel entirely confident interpreting them. But I will say that as someone who spends a lot of time dissecting literature, I don't think Melanie actually knows what a lot of these passages mean, or else she's extrapolating meanings that really aren't supported. So let's look at a single example. This is Doctrine and Covenants 64:25. And again, inasmuch as parents have children in Zion, or in any of her stakes which are organized, that teach them not to understand the doctrine of repentance, faith in Christ the Son of the living God, and of baptism and the gift of the Holy Ghost by the laying on of the hands, when 8 years old, the sin be upon the head of the parents. I read this entire chapter in D&C. It's not very long. And what it says is that you should teach your children about Jesus and God and following the commandments. Nowhere does it say that religious instruction is a parent's only obligation to their child, which is what Melanie seems to be trying to use it to argue. Over and over, I'd read scriptures she quotes and thinks, I'm not sure this says what she thinks it says. Or even more often, how is this relevant? In one of the chapters where she talks about this huge change she underwent, she says that she was suddenly able to understand the scriptures. But I think what really happened is she began interpreting them through the lens of, Jesus is responsible for everything, so I don't have to deal with anything. She definitely seems bothered by the idea that people give other people parenting advice, which is pretty rich coming from a woman who took a parenting class 13 times. I almost wonder if she wrote this part some months later and didn't realize she was contradicting things she'd said earlier in the book. She has quite the ability to hold two completely contradictory beliefs and fail to notice that they can't be true. She's not sitting with paradox or acknowledging complexity. She's just pretending there's no conflict there. We get another example of that here. When we have to ask questions about everything we should or shouldn't do, we stop listening to the Spirit and lean upon everyone else to receive inspiration for us. I can remember when I was debating how long my skirt should be one day. I felt this really nice feeling come over me that I should wear it a little longer. No judgment came from this feeling, but only love and kindness. I thought, a suggestion of how I dressed came from a place of so much love. That is how I want others to feel when others may ask me questions about such things. Okay, so God encouraged her to wear her skirt a little longer in a loving way. Great. One of the things that stood out to me the most about the Lord after he changed me is that he didn't seem to care about what I wore, what I ate, how I looked, what I have or haven't achieved. He just cared about me. She just said God wanted her to wear her skirt longer. Which is it? Did God say to wear her skirt a little longer, or does God not care how long her skirt is? She somehow jumps from this madness to talking about how people shouldn't judge each other for their accomplishments or lack thereof, gets off on a tangent about the evils of checklists, and then tells how, when she was a missionary, she had to ignore the rule book for missionaries so that she could let the Spirit guide her, and this led to ever so many baptisms. I noticed in Chad's autobiography and in Doug's dilemma that there seems to be some competitiveness among missionaries regarding how many people they lead to baptism, and that's apparent here too. She concludes, "All God wanted me to do was to feel his love for them and let the Spirit guide me. When I got out of the way, he took over." Right. You get out of the way, because heaven forbid you do anything of your own volition. Thus ends chapter 11. Chapter 12, A Child's Prayer. Okay, this isn't a prayer. I don't know why she gave it that title. It's actually more like a play without stage directions. It's just a dialogue between a mother and a son. There's nothing but dialogue. No context, no situation, no description. It says she wrote this in 2014, too. So I think she just included it to pad out this very short book. This dialogue offers a glimpse into Melanie's parenting, or at least her ideal parenting, and also her own childhood. This excerpt is the beginning. "Oh, Mom, they are being mean. Tell them to be nice." "Son, just ignore them. They can only hurt you if you let them. No one can make you mad. It is a choice." "Oh, Mom, they make me so mad. I am not going to share with them. They took my toys and didn't even ask. I really hate my brothers." "Son, I would like you to be nice and ignore their rudeness. Life isn't fair, and I am asking you to do what I have asked you to do." "Oh, Mom, it is really hard when they are so mean." "Son, I know. I had brothers too. Fighting back never worked for me, and it only hurt me. I wish I could help you, but you must learn as I have learned, how to be nice." She uses the word ignore twice here, and the word nice 3 times. It appears that her definition of nice is letting people walk all over her. The mother tells the son that God says we have to be nice to people, no matter how badly they treat us. "Mom, how did you do it? I mean, how did you not let others hurt you?" "Son, I didn't tell you about this brother that I have. He was the kind of brother that didn't let others hurt him." "Mom, how did he do that?" "Son, there is something you must know. They beat him up and made fun of him, but he never fought back. He decided a long time ago he would always obey his father." I just realized she's not talking about one of her real brothers. She's talking about Jesus. That's why she kept capitalizing he. But she didn't do it. I thought it was a typo because she didn't do it consistently. All right. Well, I don't know if what I was going to say about this is still relevant. Well, it definitely doesn't tell us anything about Melanie's childhood, as it turns out, because she's not talking about one of her actual brothers. So God is the only person who's allowed to hold anyone accountable, according to Melanie, for anything. What a terrible lesson. Even Jesus isn't allowed to hold people accountable. I was going to ask, where were Melanie's parents when their son was getting jumped? But apparently that's not relevant anymore. Jesus did discourage vengeance, but he also advocated nonviolent resistance. I'm going to link in the description to a great explanation of what turn the other cheek actually means in historical context, because that seems to be what Melanie is referencing here. That and the crucifixion, obviously. And I have no doubt that if you confronted Melanie about the fact that being nice and letting people treat you like a doormat aren't the same thing, she would reference Jesus saying, turn the other cheek. That is not what Jesus meant by turn the other cheek. You should let people beat you up in order to be nice isn't the lesson he was trying to teach. It's actually kind of an interesting historical note, exactly what Jesus really meant by turn the other cheek. I will link an article about it below. Thus ends Feel the Fire. And I'm a little frazzled now because I just realized I completely misinterpreted that. It's time to ask our concluding questions. First, what could we have done to make this book better? Well, I'd definitely hire someone to edit it and fix the interior design, because the book is rife with typos. That random attribution to the lyricist sticks out in my mind. Also, on the last page, Melanie reprinted Laurie's foreword in all caps for some reason. Why she thought it needed to be in here twice, I can't say. The biggest issue with the writing, though, is how opaque Melanie is about what was actually happening in her life. Where are the details? Where are the facts? She claims to be a very open person, but she tells us almost nothing factual about her life. I don't even know what Melanie Gibb does. Was she a stay-at-home mother? Was she a dental hygienist? Beats me. Reading between the lines, it sounds like she's done some things in her life, especially with regard to parenting, that she's ashamed of. And I understand why she wouldn't want to immortalize those events in print, but it isn't possible to effectively write about undergoing a change if she isn't going to share with her readers what things were like before and after. Simply saying, "I underwent a huge change," isn't really helpful. There isn't enough context to even make a good tweet, let alone an entire book. But that kind of avoidance leads us directly to contemplating my second question. What have we learned about Melanie Gibb from reading this? One of the few things she's upfront about is that she didn't have a great childhood, and she emerged from it without a lot of life skills. That obviously affected the way she parented her own kids. My guess is that she had 2 role models as a child. One who taught her to scream and have tantrums and blame inanimate objects, and one who taught her to ignore conflict and walk away because that's being nice, and that's what Jesus wants. She spent much of her life emulating her first rageful role model, and when she finally reached a point in her life where she had to accept that lashing out wasn't helpful, she switched to mimicking her other role model, the one who avoids, who may or may not actually be Jesus. She feels that because God told her to stop throwing tantrums and she did, she's now beyond reproach. The problem is, while she may have gotten rid of her more overtly negative behaviors, she never replaced them with healthier behaviors. She doesn't know how to be proactive. This approach, combined with a high degree of black and white thinking, has led her to avoiding her own internal experience. She doesn't seem to be fully present in her own life. She's obsessed with spiritual introspection, but is incredibly resistant to personal introspection. She only wants to look at her spirituality. She only wants to be accountable for her spirituality. And, like Chad, she resorts to her spirituality when anything throws her off balance. I was surprised when I went through all her interviews and testimony again by how consistent her story actually was. She can't remember a lot, but I think that's because she's always got her head in the clouds. Or in her case, in a prayer. She doesn't remember what happened because she was only half present to begin with. And don't get me wrong, she's definitely lying about some things. But I think she's lying first and foremost to herself. She desperately wants to believe she wasn't involved and has no culpability in the deaths. Legally, she seems to be in the clear. Morally, I guess she'll have to answer to Jesus. The reason she didn't call the police and tell them that Tylee and JJ and Tammy were in danger is that she doesn't do that. She ignores. She avoids. She's nice. I don't think it ever occurred to her that she needed to contact the police. She wasn't in touch enough with reality to realize that she needed to do so. This may well be the fiction writer in me coming through, but I tried to put myself in her shoes. I tried to apply what we've learned about her from this book to the actual situations in the case. And I focused on the phone call she received from Chad Daybell 2 days before Thanksgiving in 2019. At that point in time, the police had begun looking for the children, and they'd gone to Lori's apartment in Rexburg. Chad told Melanie that the police were going to call her, and she shouldn't pick up when they did, because Lori had told them that Melanie had JJ. Then he asked her if she did talk to them to tell them that she had JJ with her. So I'm imagining I'm Melanie. She's passive. She's disconnected. She can't stand up for herself, especially not against Chad, whom she then believed to be a true visionary. She's someone who has to be nice, and that probably goes double for her friends, so she can't turn Chad and Lori in. Getting your friends into trouble with the police isn't nice. Plus, she probably still believed in the whole doomsday thing at that point, so she might have been clinging to the idea that somehow all these deaths were sanctioned by God because the times of turmoil were beginning and the rules didn't apply anymore. She didn't have the strength of personality to resist them in that moment. When she spoke to Nate Eaton, her description of that phone call was quite dramatic. I think the reason she was so jarred by that call and Chad's request that she lie to the police was that she could no longer keep her head in the clouds. She was suddenly forced to look away from the spiritual grandeur of the Second Coming and focus on the real-world implications of the ideas they were playing with. I suspect that was a huge shock to her mental system. I have no evidence of this, but I think Lori told her what happened to the kids at that point. Maybe not in so many words, but I think Lori told her. I suspect this because during that interview with Nate, she gets real weird when they're talking about what was said on the phone call. Twice, she seems to accidentally reveal that Lori was on the call with Chad. And each time, she gets flustered and then tries to pretend she was referencing Kay Woodcock. I think Melanie was so afraid of accidentally admitting what Lori told her that she just tried to pretend that part of the call never happened. Now, contradicting this theory is the fact that Lori called Melanie later that day, but it apparently wasn't uncommon for them to call each other 3 or 4 times a day. Melanie panicked and lied to the police. She basically admitted that on the stand, and given everything about her that's evident from this book, I believe her. I'm guessing David is the reason she made the Korihor call and told the police the truth. She testified that David was in the room with her and they recorded the phone call on his phone. David was the one who wanted to investigate whether or not JJ was really a zombie, instead of just saying, "He seems like himself to me, let's go record a podcast." David was the one who wanted to see JJ in the morning, who asked where he was. I think Lori was probably dead on when she accused Melanie of being under David's influence during the Korihor call. That whole call makes sense to me now. When she says, "This doesn't sound like you, Mel," I think it probably didn't sound like Mel, because Melanie is passive. David is the one who takes the initiative, and I bet that's part of Melanie's attraction to him. And did you notice how slow Lori is to respond in the early parts of the call? I think she's trying to figure out why Melanie is acting like she doesn't know what happened to the kids. Lori catches on real quick that Melanie's recording this to play for the police. I was wrong before. They aren't speaking a foreign language. They're speaking in code because they both know the cops were going to hear everything they said. Why would Melanie have made that call if she didn't know what happened to Tylee and JJ? The only other reason I can think of is that Melanie wanted to prove to the police that Chad and Lori asked her to lie for them. But I'm not really sure what purpose that would serve. The police weren't going to decide whether or not to charge her based on the fact that her friends asked her to lie. They don't care about that. One thing that's always struck me as strange is that Melanie didn't go to the police and ask them to record the call for her. I mean, it's not like David and Melanie had recording equipment. Melanie put the call on speakerphone, and David recorded it on his phone using his voice recording app. I think they wanted to know what Chad and Lori were going to say before they turned the recording over to the police. Lori could easily have said, "Why are you asking if JJ's okay when you know damn well he isn't?" Melanie didn't want the police hearing that. And even during this confrontation, Melanie can't just say how she feels and what she wants. I think the best description of her speaking style is folksy passive-aggressive. I've never in my life heard 2 women sound so chipper and cheerful while having an argument. It's demented. So yeah, that's what I think Melanie Gibb's role in all this was. I don't think she consciously knew the kids were in danger. I think she should have known, but she was too busy praying to realize what would have been obvious to anyone else. She lacks strength of character, and the only ways she knows how to deal with her emotions are to blow up or suppress. She seems to have convinced herself that this emotional repression is what Jesus taught, which is just such a strange take. All of this is speculation, but especially this part. I'd wager that the reason she isn't in touch with her feelings or her surroundings, the reason she's so obsessively focused on religion, is that she's actually in a lot of emotional pain. It sounds like she had a rotten childhood, and if she never developed or learned how to deal with that pain, then the easiest solution is to repress it. Otherwise, she risks being overwhelmed by agony. I don't think Melanie Gibb is a fundamentally bad person. I think she probably wants to be a good person more than anything. But I think she's emotionally immature, and she isn't capable of true introspection. She's so disconnected from her emotions that she ends up being a bit distant from reality. That's why she's never demonstrated any true sorrow for Tylee or JJ or Charles. I don't think she knew Tammy. She can't feel it because if she lets any more pain in, she'll drown. It's possible she would explode. Ironically, I think the closest she's come to therapy were probably those hours in her prayer closet. She spent 6 months complaining. At least some of that time had to be spent recounting bad things that had happened to her. Then she spent 3 more months considering her sins, which might have helped her release guilt over her past actions. That could potentially have acted as a therapeutic process for her. Maybe the mighty change of heart she underwent was actually a partial psychological healing. I'm not suggesting that Melanie doesn't bear responsibility for what happened. She does. She should have told the police everything she knew. She still should. But I don't think she's a psychopath or a sociopath, or even ill-intentioned, ultimately. Ultimately, I think she's so desperate to be a good person, to be a nice person, that she ended up doing something terrible. And that is yet another tragedy in a situation that's already tragic. Melanie has continued to blame energy work for all of this. It's idiotic, but she's claiming that doing energy work makes people susceptible to Satan. It's just another fixation she's using to avoid facing the truth. She hasn't changed at all, as far as I can tell. This is an excerpt from a posting she made on a vow after everything came out. She's talking about how upset she was and how she prayed. I was so fearful one day after all this happened to me. I couldn't sleep well. I couldn't eat much. I cried a lot, and I told the Lord, I can't feel you because I have so much fear. I don't even know how to give this to you. He gently reminded me of how I let the Savior help me once before. I said, well, you said all, so that includes me. So here are all my burdens, my sins, my fears. Take them. I can't do it anymore. They were gone immediately, because I knew he carried all our burdens and sins. They were his to carry and not mine. I did just that. I moved out of the way and let him take it all. I stood up and walked with his peace. So she's still doing the poof prayer thing, where she basically names things she doesn't want to think or feel about, and then God makes them go poof. Nothing has changed in the way that Melanie interacts with her life. And then she went on to explain that Charles, JJ, Tylee, and Tammy died so that the world can learn how evil energy work is. No, Melanie. JJ, Tylee, and Tammy died because you did nothing. Those are my thoughts on Melanie Gibb. I'll end with a quote from John Stuart Mill. Let not one pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. I am now turning my attention to Visions of Glory. I'm not sure how many videos that will require, but we'll get through it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Please don't reach out to anyone associated with this case, and remember to use your words wisely. Thanks. Simplistic and full of laurel. I just combined the words logical and moral. A lot of the true crime, to help people find a higher and more meaningful relationship. And with her, I thought that said something really inappropriate. Amazed how much love and light flow from their fro. Is this the right? I feel like this isn't the right. He is so forgiving and only wants to help us, but he will not control for us. What? I would yell, slam doors, and just felt angry inside. Potential. An Amazon review, and I don't have that review pulled up. My first child was a perfect little baby whom I felt love beyond. He is so forgiving and only wants to... about how her child's behavior bothered her. Why am I so itchy? For example, on the last page of this chapter, oh wait, that's not what it says. Okay. That Melanie was referencing something else. Then apparently was this change went. What? Or is just... Oh, okay. Crap. It was the most powerful. I started noticing I would yell. I had no idea how many planes went overhead until I tried to record with the windows open. She says, ugh. And Jesus didn't talk about anything. Anything. What the hell am I saying? Not for everything. How she responded to a friend who was emotionally she's very passive aggressive, and that's what all the scripture. Part of being charred. When a person is down in the hole, I would often jump down there to try to find a way out. Wait, what? About how? I have come to... is an ungodly habit. I need to re-record that. I know this is a metaphor, but my suspicion is that this is how Melanie actually responds when people tell her about their problems. And I keep imagining what it would have been like if baby Jessica had fallen down that well in 1985 or whenever, and the 911 dispatcher had just been like, hey, this is Jesus Christ. If you pray to him, maybe he'll get you out of this well. Sorry.